For thousands of years, humanity has sought the answers to life's greatest questions. Where do we come from? What lies beyond? And does anything truly end? The ancient Egyptians, masters of mystery and keepers of sacred knowledge, wove a tapestry of myths, tales of gods, floods, and fire. They did not fear death. They studied it, embraced it, and sought to conquer it. From the hidden chambers of the pyramids to the sacred texts buried with the dead, they left behind a roadmap to eternity. Myths of divine kings, celestial journeys, and a world beyond this one, where the fate of the soul was weighed against cosmic order. But buried within these ancient texts is a secret, a legend of a god's wrath, of a flood that nearly erased humanity, of fire that scorched the earth, and of a celestial voyage that defied time itself. Was the end of the world ever truly imagined? Or did the Egyptians see time as a never-ending cycle, an endless rebirth? Join us as we journey into the heart of ancient Egypt's most profound beliefs, unraveling the myths of the gods, the secrets of the afterlife, and the hidden truths behind their visions of eternity. Prepare for a story written in stone, whispered through the sands of time. This is history reawakened.
To understand the world and human life, ancient and modern peoples have asked, where are the universe and its inhabitants, and where does it all go? In the following pages, we shall consider the ideas developed in the Nile Valley regarding the issue of all things, especially concerning man's death and that other world to which he hoped or feared to go after death. First, Egyptian texts do not contain any myths predicting the world's end. Whether no such myth existed and men in the Nile Valley could not imagine that this best of all worlds should one day no longer be, or whether the absence of such indications is the result of chance, cannot now be decided. The idea that people must have thought logically about the world's end and accepted its beginning as a creation doesn't work for the Egyptians. In their speculations, they didn't care about claims of logic, accuracy, and other modern standards. But though they did not conceive the destruction of the whole world, they possessed myths that tell of attempts on the part of the never entirely successful in destroying portions of the earth or humanity. As far as their contents are concerned, these myths belong to the widespread cycle of deluge legends. First to be noted in this connection is a passage in a hymn of about 2000 BC, addressed to the deity embracing and ruling the whole world. It alludes to a deluge in the words, "Thy flood, the gods, rises to the heavens, and the roaring water of thy mouth is in the clouds. Thy jackals are on the mountains." That is to say, the jackals, which, according to an idea prevailing especially in the New Kingdom, drew the sun god in his boat, have retreated to the mountains. The Yeta of the god Horus covers the vast spaces of all lands. The flood of waters covers all quarters of the heaven and the sea. The lands would be, even now, the dominion of the flood, if they were not under your sway. The waters move now upon the way that thou appointest. They cannot pass over what thou ordainest, the path that thou openest before them. According to the text, this deluge, which covered the trees and drove the sun god to the mountains, came up from beneath, as the Egyptians were supposed to have done with the Nile flood. A similar story was probably at the source of the Platonic dialogue Timaeus, in which Egyptian authorities are often quoted. It is used as an argument to deny the flooding of the world and the destruction of its inhabitants, at least as far as Egypt is concerned. For according to Plato, it was by similar floods in other lands that towns perished, and only the herders were saved. In Egypt, however, neither then nor at any other time did water flow down from above upon the fields. It came up from below, and hence it was that in Egypt were preserved the memorials of ancient times. In the valley of the Nile, the whole conception of a flood no doubt arose from the frequent occurrence of fossil shells in the strips of the desert at the edge of the cultivated land and on the Egyptian hills. In their presence the Greeks observed them, and Herodotus based his Egypt origin theory. He pronounced the land to be alluvial, formed by the gradual deposit of mud in an arm of the sea. This opinion is correct, although the Greek historian greatly underestimated the time the process could have been completed, allowing only 10 to 20,000 years. The words immediately preceding the passage in Plato alluded to above have often been adduced to prove that the tradition of a world conflagration had a place in Egyptian mythology. But the passage in question by no means proves this. A priest of the city of Sais in Lower Egypt is there represented as saying that, in consequence of the divergence at long intervals of the heavenly bodies that encircle the earth, all that is on earth is destroyed by fire, but that the Nile protects the Egyptians by pouring forth its waters in flood. According to this text, the destruction wrought by such a conflagration is denied concerning the Nile Valley. We should stop referring to certain passages in Egyptian writings that purport to depict the same myth. In them, we read of a fire that threatened the god Horus, the son of Isis, and which Isis succeeded in extinguishing with water. It is believed that the goddess quenched the fire, causing water to rise. But in this passage, there is no mention of a burning world, only of the burning of the place where Horus was at the time, probably the hut in the delta, where Isis hid him when she was seeking the body of Osiris, and where he was exposed to many dangers. The primitive means by which Isis procured the water to extinguish a world in flames were at least somewhat peculiarly inadequate. An early version of this ingenious passage is found in the Ebers Papyrus, about 1800 BC. Thus, there is nothing in Egyptian texts to throw off such ideas in other countries regarding the destruction of the world, whether by water or fire. We gain a deeper understanding of a tradition that depicts a divine endeavor to eradicate humanity's sinful race. This myth has been preserved in two versions in the graves of King Seti I and Ramesses III, and these forms date from about 1400 to 1200 BC. Several other references exist, showing that since the second millennium BC, it must have been well known whether it existed earlier in Egypt. We cannot claim that we have not yet discovered certain proofs of its existence. Like most Egyptian myths, this also connects to the sun god Ra-Harmakis, Egypt's first divine king, whom the legends portray as entirely human. He grows old and weak like other men, and we read of him often as an older man from whose failing hands the reins of government are gradually slipping. Gods and men venture to resist him, trying to cast him from his throne or push him more into the background. The myth now under consideration begins with these words: Ra is the god who created himself. He was the king of gods and men. Men took counsel together against his majesty and said, Lo, the god Ra has aged, transforming his bones into silver, his limbs into gold, and his hair into lapis lazuli. The sun god heard these words and called together the other gods to consider what ought to be done to those men who owed their existence to the eye, that is to say, to the tears of the god, who now were rebelling against their Lord and Creator. The gods advised him to send out his eye against the rebels through the goddess Hathor Sekhet, that is to say, an incarnation of the sun in his burning and scorching might. The goddess took action. The goddess set forth to slay humanity. Several nights she waded in human blood from Heracleopolis Magna in Middle Egypt to Heliopolis, the most sacred city of the Nile Valley, where the gods were wont to meet in council. However, the god soon repented of his command, saving humanity from complete extinction. He dispatched messengers to Elephantine to collect fruits known for their intoxicating and narcotic properties. In Heliopolis, these were pressed, and at the same time, corn was crushed for beer. The two were mixed, and 7,000 jugs of beer were made. Sekhet poured this beer over the fields during the night, covering them with the blood of the men he had killed. 11. And the goddess Sekhet came in the morning. She found the fields flooded, rejoiced, her heart was light. She went about drunken, and no longer heeded men. Humanity was saved, and in memory of this a feast was instituted at which much beer was drunk in honor of Sekhet, a feast that was celebrated up to the Greek period. But the god Ra was no longer willing to rule over ungrateful men. When men knew this, they repented. They took bows and arrows and killed all who had rebelled against the god. Then Ra spoke, "Your sin is forgiven. The killing you have done on my behalf atones for the killing my foes plotted against me. Despite this forgiveness, men have failed at their aim so far that the old god held to his resolve to go away to a better world, newly created by himself. To earth, he left a new young son as lord and king as a substitute for his sun power. These are the only indications in Egyptian texts of the conception of an impending or once threatened destruction of the world and humanity. The information saved about how the Egyptians thought about the end of each person is much more complete in every way. Their thoughts on the end of humans, gods, and animals are included. It is owing to the peculiar character of the remains in the Nile Valley that we are so well informed on this point. These relics relate almost exclusively to death and are the spoils of tombs and funerary temples. The Egyptians thought deeply and joyfully about death, a concept that did not frighten them as it does modern Orientals. To them, death was no final end, but only an interruption of their existence. It was a violent interruption. Death was not a natural result of wearing out the body for the ancient Egyptians. To him, each death was a kind of murder. Man's body throughout life was regarded as a battlefield where good and evil spirits fought for mastery. If the man remained healthy, the former had the upper hand. If he fell sick, the latter had succeeded in gaining ascendancy. Hence, he must do his best to help the good spirits. He did this by wearing amulets to drive away the evil ones, or by repeating spells against them. Even in diseases caused by evil spirits, these were the orthodox remedies. The medicines administered simultaneously only served to reduce symptoms and owed much of their virtue to spells repeated during their preparation. The cure was not due to the medicines, but to the conquest, by spells and powerful magic symbols of the demon, who had entered into the man and caused his suffering. With the departure of the demon, the sickness ended. The strife in and about the human body lasted longer or shorter, according to the power of the spirits at strife. But experience had taught men that the evil spirits always won a species of victory. One of the countless male and female sicknesses, male and female deaths, as the Egyptians expressed it, succeeded at last in destroying the man's mortal frame. However, the death of the body was merely a single event in a struggle that extended beyond death, and the existence of the man's immortal parts could potentially face numerous dangers, just as his mortal frame had been subjected to numerous risks during his lifetime. Hostile spirits had the potential to prepare him for a second death, prompting the Egyptians to diligently explore methods that would prove effective beyond death, safeguarding themselves and their ancestors from potential threats. In this world and the next, the best and only hopeful precaution against any threatened danger was the knowledge of the appropriate spell. Egyptian religious literature, therefore, consists to a large extent of collections of such spells. They were sculptured on the walls of the grave, or on the sides of the sarcophagus, or written on papyrus rolls, and placed with the dead in the tomb. That is also why there is so comparatively little to be learned from these religious texts regarding the actual conditions of existence in the world to come. They tell us exactly what name a man had to give when he arrived at one of the gates of eternity, exactly what the bench, helm, and sails of the death ship were called, the exact forms of the many names and titles of Osiris, and what words the demons must be greeted with who dwelt in the various areas of this mysterious kingdom, but they give no complete picture of the appearance of that world. It is certainly possible to translate the individual formulas, but it is often impossible to understand them, as they refer to myths unknown to us, and it is so far from clear that the myths cannot be reconstructed from the formulas. Here, for example, is a spell against snakes of about 3000 BC. The snake curls round the calf, the snake curls round the calf, O hippopotamus, that earnest forth from the earth. Thou devoured what came forth from thee. Snake, as you descend, lie down, draw back. The snake overthrows the god Hempesetet in the water, and you catch sight of the god Ra. We don't know what the calf, hippopotamus, and snake mean, or the incident that brings them together. The sentences give us words, but the meaning evades us. It is the same with countless other formulas of a similar kind, and this fact, together with the many clerical blunders committed by the early copyists in putting together their papyri, shows that, even to them, the spells were often not entirely comprehensible. Additionally to the problem of not having enough information to reconstruct the idea of a future life in the Nile Valley, we must also add that the Egyptians did not use any organized thought, which allowed them to write and believe the most contradictory ideas simultaneously. They never tried to organize their religion, reject opposite dogmas, and make them consistent. On the other hand, they faithfully retained all that their ancestors had once believed and all that later generations had added, untroubled by the various modes of thought that existed and mingled. People first became interested in the different local cults, which had grown independently in different city and village temples after starting out as part of a common foundation. These developments were often very different from one another. The ancient faiths, once held among the various tribes from which the Egyptian people had sprung in primitive times, remained in their original forms, presenting themselves side by side in a bewildering variety. Nor is this all. Throughout history, Egyptian beliefs incorporated numerous religious ideas from neighboring countries without any alterations. This is how the Semitic gods Baal, Astarte, and their friends were accepted alongside Egypt's gods. For a long time, people believed that only later texts contained this confusion of religious ideas. Since the inscriptions in the 5th and 6th dynasties' pyramids have come to light, we know this chaos is as old as any literary Egyptian tradition. Undoubtedly, it must have come about gradually, but the period of its development lies beyond our knowledge of the Egyptian people. Therefore, engaging in conjectures about its trajectory appears pointless, as any misstep or fresh revelation of a text could upend it. In our knowledge, a cautious student will confine himself to stating the separate dogmas, examining their changes during Egyptian history, and inquiring into their meaning. The question of their origin and age is better left on one side. Among the various Egyptian conceptions of the other world, one of the most important and widely diffused is connected with the sun and its apparent course during the 24 hours. The traveling of the star of the day was accomplished, in the opinion of the Egyptian, in exactly the same way as his own when he undertook a journey through his native land, namely by boat. But the sun god traveled on a celestial ocean or a celestial Nile, flowing fairly straight through the celestial land as the earthly river flows through Egypt. On this river, the gunboat typically glided alongside the stream, requiring only a rudder. The names of oars and sails were infrequent. Jackals typically tow the gunboat in exceptional cases. This recalls how boats were taken upstream in the Nile Valley. But the human force used here below was replaced in celestial regions by that of creatures partaking of the divine nature. In the middle of the sunboat there is a shrine-like cabin in which the sun god, represented by day as a hawk-headed man, stands or sits, and on the boat there is generally a helmsman, besides various gods forming the court of the King of Heaven. According to the most numerous ancient representations, the god uses 2 boats for his journey during the daytime, one for the morning and another for the afternoon, and changes boats at noon. Later on, the journey was less simple. At the end of each hour, the god disembarked and embarked again in another boat. The journey was supposed to occupy 12 hours, that is to say, the time from sunrise to sunset, divided into 12 equal parts. We can conclude from this that the Egyptians did not view an hour as a fixed space of time, unlike us. Its length varied with the season, longest at midsummer and shortest at midwinter. The length of the hours of the night varied correspondingly. The time from sunset to sunrise was divided into 12 equal parts, and their length varied oppositely from the hours of the day. Each hour was in charge of a special goddess who, throughout its duration, kept watch and accompanied the sun god on that part of his voyage. The day journey ended in the west, and then the night journey began. The sunboat floated back to sunrise in the east, on a stream flowing through the kingdom of night. This journey of the sun god seemed to the Egyptians to be symbolic of man's life. The sun god is born in the morning, ages in the day, and sinks in the evening as an older man into darkness to rise in the morning once more to new life. According to the general idea, the sun god's birth and death occurred daily. A second conception suggests that the process concludes within a year. The god awakes with the spring sun to new life and dies with the sun of winter. Here, the condition of death involved 24 hours being absent or reduced to a brief space. Based on references in the texts, there may have been other ideas about the sun god's life that said it was much longer, lasting at least 360 years. These references probably came from different times in history. However, these indications remain unclear, and these ideas never gained widespread popularity. An exhaustive description of the night journey of the sun god is first found in texts of the New Kingdom, i.e., after 1700 BC. Yet many passages in older inscriptions and pictorial representations, especially on coffins of the Middle Kingdom, indicate that the doctrine existed much earlier, though it does not seem to have taken fixed form until the 2nd millennium. The Book of Amduat and the Book of the Gates describe the underworld's topography separately. These texts are found in papyri, on sarcophagi, and more or less fully in the tombs of the kings, from the 18th to the 20th dynasty, in a short as well as a fuller and illustrated edition. Despite the contradictory nature of their contents, the Book of Amduat and the Book of the Gates are found inscribed in the same tomb, another indication of how little attempt the Egyptians made at systematic thought on religious subjects. These doctrines flourished when the kings lived mostly in Thebes and probably developed around the Theban priesthood, as they are written in their tombs and relatives. This fact also explains why the sun god of the night is always represented in these books as a ram-headed man, since it was in the form of a ram that Ammon, the powerful god of Thebes, had descended to earth. The texts consistently depict the god's ram's horns as protruding from the sides of the head. Now it has been thought possible to prove that of the two kinds of rams associated with Egyptian deities, the ram with the horizontal horns was sacred to the god Shnuphis of Elephantine, and that the horn curling round the car, so well known from the Roman statues of Jupiter Ammon, belonged to the god Ammon. Figures of kings of the 19th dynasty wore such horns occasionally as a headdress in token of their descent from the god Ammon, and with a similar implication, Alexander the Great and his successors had them sculpted on their statues. Using this distinction across Egypt would negate any connection between the nocturnal sun god and Ammon of Thebes, but the monuments disprove this. In the period now under consideration, Ammon is frequently represented with horizontal horns, even in circumstances where there can be no thought of blending his form with that of Shnuphis. It was, for the most part, artistic or practical reasons that then decided the choice, and in statues, the horizontal horns are almost always avoided as having the less durable form. Over the entrances to the tombs of the kings, there is carved as a kind of superscription a sun's disk in which the figure of the god is placed, as just described, and behind it is the figure of a large scarab. The first is the god of the night sun, to whose kingdom the tomb belonged and whose dominions its inscriptions describe, while the scarab is an emblem of the morning sun waking to new life, and is at the same time a symbol of the renewed life of man after his earthly death. The order of the scenes in these representations of the underworld is generally the same. The reliefs run along the walls in 3 rows, one above the other. The middle shows the underworld river on which the sunboat sails, sometimes carried along by the stream, sometimes by spells, and sometimes towed by spirits subject to the god. Above and below are pictures of the banks of the river. Ahead of the boat and on the banks stand, sit, and lie, in bewildering variety, the innumerable demons that populate the fields of the night. At times they manifest as humans, at other times as animals, particularly snakes, whose existence in an underground kingdom was a natural expectation. Sometimes they appeared as cynocephali, often associated with the sun in the Nile Valley. Sometimes they are half animal, half human, and most grotesquely composite creatures. The names of the lemons on the monuments indicate that few had any connection to the land's mighty gods. Most of them are gods of one special function, whose names indicate their immediate employment: the cutting one, the rending one, and the stabber. Some were friendly to the sun god, but countless others were hostile to him. At the head of the latter was the enormous snake Apophis, the incarnation of the power of darkness, who strives to bar the way of the sun god and work his destruction. The friends of the sun god always conquer him at the last moment, fettering him, cutting him asunder, but never killing him. No matter how wounded, he invariably returns to life again and resumes the strife with the good god of warmth and light, a strife that, in Egyptian opinion, never ended in victory on either side. We need not, here, describe all the genii of this underworld. You can study the various spirits in the 2 books mentioned above, each represented differently. The one text is easily distinguished from the other, for in the book of Amduat, each hour space is separated from the next by a door. In the book of the gates, the door is replaced by a fortified pylon. The demons, excepting a few companions of the sun god, always remain in the same space, and according to this special doctrine of a future life, so do the men who have died. They join the sun on his journey from the western horizon and are left by the god in different parts of the underworld, where he gives them fields to till on which they must henceforth live as vassals, always ready to help their lord against his foes, if any should threaten to attack him on his passage. Theirs, however, was no joyful lot. With delight, they hailed the sun god on his appearance, but at the end of an hour, he vanished. The door of their room closed after him, and for the next 23 hours, they had to wait in a darkness that was relieved only by the light that came from fire-breathing serpents or from the sea of flame in which the captive foes of the sun god were burning. Both kings and subjects alike suffer the same fate. Few indeed are the mortals who succeed in escaping it, and those who do are not such as have lived upright lives on earth. They are those who have acquired an exceptionally large knowledge of magic and have striven also never to show themselves enemies of the sun god. These succeeded in constraining him not to set them down on his course, but to bear them along in his train, ever circling around the heavens in the solar bark. The ancient Egyptians occasionally viewed this view as unjust, believing that good and bad were equally valued in the life to come, and that the deity did not grant any special rewards to those who had obeyed his commands on earth after death. A judgment scene was added to the Book of the Gates, in which a sentence is pronounced on the deceased, similar to the judgment before Osiris in the Book of the Dead. Between the 5th and the 6th hour space, there is a hall in which Osiris sits upon his throne, surrounded by the gods of his circle. In his presence, the soul of the man is weighed against his deeds, while at the same time, a cynocephalus, the animal incarnation of the god Thoth, drives a hog from the hall with a stick, the representative of Set, the god of evil, and banishes it from the company of the good. In the next space, the good are seen tilling the fields, while the wicked, tied to stakes, are awaiting their punishment, and will eventually be cast into seas of water or fire. The text's integration of this judgment scene is inadequate. It is inserted bodily to fill a mental hole, and the parts of the work that assume there is no judgment have not been changed. Most notable is that the interpolation is made later in the text rather than at the beginning. Logically, the judgment should occur before the god, accompanied by the dead, begins his journey through the underworld. Neither did the Egyptians ever attempt to represent in detail the journey of the souls of the just and the unjust as far as this judgment hall. A series of exhortations to enjoy life reflect the same melancholic conception of existence after death. Since about 2000 BC, many Egyptian texts have expressed these concepts in various ways, yet they always share common thoughts. For example, a stela puts into the mouth of a dead wife the following adjuration to her husband: "O my comrade, my husband, cease not to eat and drink, to be drunken, to enjoy the love of women, to hold a festival, follow your longings by day and night. Give care no room in your heart." The Westland, a domain of the dead, is a land of sleep and darkness, a dwelling place wherein those who are there remain. They sleep in their mummy forms. They wake no more to see their comrades. They see neither father nor mother. Their hearts do not yearn for wives and children. On earth each drinks the water of life, but I suffer from thirst. Water comes to him that sojourns on earth, but I pine for the water by me. I long for the breeze on the bank of the river to soothe my heart in its woe. The name of the god who rules here is Total Death. At his call, all men come unto him, trembling with fear. He does not distinguish between gods and humans, viewing both as equal. He shows no favor to him who loves him. He carries away the child from his mother and the gray-haired man alike. None comes to worship him, for he is not gracious to his worshippers. He pays no heed to him who brings gifts to him. The systems hitherto considered all placed the dwelling of the dead in a kingdom below ground. Another series represents it as in the sky above the earth. Contradictory opinions reigned as to how the soul succeeded in gaining admission either to the sunboat among the stars or to the wide-spreading fields of the blessed. One theory suggests that the soul journeyed to the location on the horizon where the sun sank through a narrow cleft in a rock and then ascended into the boat. We have seen already that, according to one view, with the help of magic, the dead might succeed in sailing with the sun through the whole realm of the underworld, and in the morning rise with him again in the eastern sky. Others postulated the existence of a certain ladder, using which the dead could climb into heaven with the help of a particular spell. A third conception, connected with the practice of burning the body, represents the soul of the dead man as rising to heaven from his ashes. Even though this idea has been around for a long time in Egypt, it never caught on. This is because burning the body had become so uncommon by the time of the pyramids that it was only done sometimes and almost always for kings. Eventually, embalming took its place. The practice was not, however, forgotten, and traces of it are found in the 2nd millennium BC in the sacrifice offered at the burial of distinguished persons when human beings were burned so that they might be sent as quickly as possible after the dead man to act as his servants. The idea that burning was an efficacious method of forwarding anything to the dead continuously survived in dispatching gifts to the upper regions using burnt offerings, a custom in radical contrast to the far more common one of placing them in the grave. The latter method presupposes a temporary sojourn for the dead man in the tomb. A more prevalent idea than either of these as to the means of transit from this world into the next was one according to which the soul rises to heaven in the form of a bird, in the case of a king, almost invariably as a sparrowhawk. Usually, however, and especially where ordinary mortals were concerned, the soul took the form of the so-called Ba, a human-headed bird, sometimes represented with human arms. Jean really thought it was a male bird, an Egyptian idiosyncrasy to think of a deceased person in the next world as a male, even though she was a woman, to call her Osiris, and to attribute to her a male soul bird. Seldom in early, though somewhat more often in later times, the dead woman keeps her sex, is called not Osiris, but Hathor, and is figured as a soul bird with a woman's headdress, without a beard, and occasionally with a woman's breast. Heaven once attained, the soul dwelt henceforth in the circle of the gods. The texts don't explain how and why it was given a place among the gods and other souls. The pyramid inscriptions, from about 3000 BC, are more detailed regarding the souls of the kings, and show that the king had to first win a fight with the older gods in the place that he claimed corresponded to his earthly rank. It was the same with the deceased pharaoh as with Osiris before he became king of the dead in the west. Before Osiris could begin his reign, he had to forcefully conquer the old gods who had previously ruled there. The arrival of the dead prince in heaven is described as follows: "The sky weeps, the stars quiver, the warders of the gods tremble, and their servants flee when they see the king arise as a spirit, as a god who lives on his fathers and takes possession of his mothers. His servants have captured the gods using a lasso, dragged them forward, bound them, cut their throats, removed their entrails, cut them into pieces, and boiled them in hot cauldrons. The king devours their magic power and eats their souls. The great gods are his breakfast, the medium gods his midday meal, the lesser gods his supper, and the old gods and goddesses he uses as fuel. The king devours everything that comes in his way. He swallows all greedily, and his magic power becomes greater than all magic. He is an inheritor of might more than all other inheritors. He becomes the Lord of heaven, for he ate all the crowns and all the armbands. He ate the wisdom of every god," etc., etc. The king becomes Lord of heaven by conquering and devouring the gods, with the emblems of their power and ornaments. There is a widespread belief that man can acquire spiritual qualities through purely material processes. Various peoples practice eating the heart, the brain of a defeated foe, or the brain of a powerful animal, among other similar customs. Numerous assertions supported this train of thought in Egypt. He who would be true ate truth in the form of a little image of the goddess of truth. A god bestowed life and power by allowing his favored one to breathe in through his nostrils life and power in the form of the hieroglyphic signs representing them. You could gain immortality by sucking the breast of a goddess and imbibing her immortality through her milk. Thus, in the pyramid text, the king becomes an all-embracing godhead using his meal of gods, though the fact must be emphasized that the other gods were not supposed to cease to exist. As truth may be eaten by an individual man and endure to be consumed in the same way by others after him, gods retained their independent existences. Despite being devoured, there is no indication of how the Egyptians explained that the king, who had become a god, kept his dominion and did not fall victim to the next dead pharaoh, who likewise was equipped with all magic power. They probably did not trouble themselves, and were content to picture their future life as pleasantly as possible without considering later generations and their claims of immortality. Under the earth and above it, the Egyptians imagined a realm of the dead. He also held that a similar kingdom existed on the earth itself. How this resurrection on earth was supposed to be brought about is again very variously represented. Plant life provides inspiration for some of the concepts. A tree sprang up from the body or some part of it, such as a drop of blood shed by the dying man, which became his new body. Sometimes the seed of life was the blossom, the wood, so a splinter could prolong the life if the tree fell. This tree represents the living being after death. Later times, when the myths had lost their original force, the tree overshadowed the chest containing the corpse of Osiris, the story of which is known to us through Greek authors. Other representations show not a tree but corn springing from the body. According to widely diffused ideas, it was thus that Osiris woke to new life, and his example was, in a certain sense, catching. Sometimes there was a bed near the coffin on which a miniature cornfield in the form of Osiris was made to sprout in the hope that the deceased would follow the divine example. The sprouting was no symbol to the Egyptians of historical times. The texts declare distinctly that Osiris was the corn that had sprung from his mummy. Owing to a similar train of thought, a conventionalized aquatic plant became one of the commonest amulets denoting the resurrection. The goddesses, ever renewing their youth, carry the same as a scepter. Another series of accounts represents the resurrection as an awakening to new life in the body laid in the grave. They tell in enormous detail, often with a lot of triviality, how the dead man opens his mouth again, how he can move his arms and legs, how his digestion begins to work, and how the power of generation returns to him. We can group these various lines of thought together, each addressing the doctrine of immortality for Osiris. Much as they differ in detail, they have this in common. They always name the god Osiris as a prototype, the first being to whose lot such a resurrection fell. Osiris, the son of the god of earth and the goddess of heaven, was the first king who humanly ruled Egypt. He showed his divine nature by his graciousness and beneficence, but he did not succeed in winning all hearts. His brother Set plotted against him. With the aid of several other conspirators, he ensnared Osiris and murdered him. The later form of this myth states that they placed Osiris's body in a chest and threw it into the Nile. His wife and sister, the goddess Isis, who represented the divine ideal of a wife and mother to the Egyptians, discovered it after long wanderings. According to an older legend, the murderers cut the body in pieces and scattered them over the land. For a long time, Isis wandered until she had found all, or almost all, the parts. She then put them together and restored the body to bury it. However, other authorities assert that she left each part in its original location and buried it in a temple that the Greeks later distinguished as a Serapeum. In such sanctuaries, special respect was paid to certain parts of the god's body, for example, in Letopolis, the neck, in Athribis, the heart, and in Abydos, the head was sacred. However, in the same temples, men believed in the story of Osiris's burial as a whole, which was very different from the cult of the separate parts. They held feasts to honor this story. The early Egyptian belief in Osiris's mutilation may have been linked to the custom of dismembering human corpses. It was divided into a varying number of pieces, but the severance of the head from the rest of the corpse was considered especially important. The pieces were buried near the deceased's former dwelling in the cultivated land. After the flesh decayed, they dug up the bones, cleaned them, and buried them in their final tomb in the desert sand at the edge of the Nile Valley. Even during the era of the pyramid builders, this custom declined in popularity, although it remained prevalent later. Reli I, formulated in funerary texts, is based on the belief that the severed bead will be restored to the dead man in the next world. Occasionally, even in comparatively late periods, people still practice the custom. There have been beheaded bodies embalmed, the head fastened to the neck with a stick, and the whole body wrapped in mummy cloths. During the pyramid era, individuals sometimes treated the entire body similarly. It was allowed to decay. The different bones were collected. Each was wrapped separately in linen, and the linen packets were placed together in the order corresponding to the position of the bones in the human skeleton. In later times, the dismemberment and reconstruction of the corpse were not solely motivated by the desire to ease the deceased's transition into the afterlife. It was likely also motivated by the desire to create obstacles for his return to this world. Like many others, the ancient Egyptians believed that the deceased lacked the joy of life and were often viewed as malevolent entities who, driven by jealousy, sought to torment and disturb their living. The more carefully the burial rites were carried out, the sooner the departed souls might be appeased. To satisfy them fully was difficult, if not impossible. It was therefore important to resort to the same expedients that have been employed by the peoples of many lands to protect themselves against the dead, who might return to earth as vampires, e.g., cutting off the head of the corpse. If the human body is the only form for the dead, this remedy may be infallible, but in the Nile Valley, the dead man returning to earth could choose from many other forms. He risked doing so if he saw his body mutilated and wanted to punish the perpetrators. This must have been the consideration that led the Egyptians to reconstruct the body after dismembering it. He would be satisfied if the dead man came to his grave to see that all was right, and the corpse seemed outward and in perfect condition. If he thought of re-entering his grave in an unhappy moment, the body crumbled or lost its head, destroying his hope of regaining his former shape. Such thoughts certainly assume a remarkable absence of insight on the dead man's part. But that's again a conception common to almost all nations. People commonly represent death, the devil, and their circle of spirits as stupid and easily deceived. Countless examples of this are to be found not only in the tales of the ancient and modern East. In the folklore of northern nations, there is a rich and varied illustration of the same ideas. Occasionally, the legend of the dismemberment of the body of Osiris is associated with a similar treatment of the human corpse, but this occurs seldom in comparison with the countless assertions that the body of Osiris was buried intact. His relatives fulfilled this pious duty and thus showed men what it meant for them to do in similar cases. Isis sang the lament over her brother, supported by their sister Nephthys, and repeated the spells to protect the dead against the dangers of the next world. The jackal-headed Anubis, who, like the Greek Hermes, stands ready to accompany the dead into the land of shadows, did not confine himself to this duty for Osiris, but also undertook the burial. Horus, the son of Osiris, avenged his father's death on the murderer Set, and after a long and changeful conflict, he wrested the succession to the throne of Egypt. But the amazing result of all this zeal on the part of the survivors was this: Osiris gained the power to go on living in his former shape, to overcome the demons of the other world, and to found a new kingdom in their dominion, over which he reigned as a gracious and just ruler of the dead, even as he had once ruled in this world over the living. This myth represented his own fate to the ancient Egyptians. Like Osiris, he must die, but like Osiris, he hoped to rise again and live on in the world to come, not only in his earthly body, but also generally with his earthly rank as a loyal subject and vassal of his god and king. In this cycle of conceptions, the embalming of the body was considered the primary requirement for ensuring the permanence of the personality. That elaborate treatment of the corpse, which has long seemed the most striking of Egyptian customs, aimed to hinder the rapid decay incident in such a hot climate. The Egyptian method of arresting it was certainly very simple and somewhat rough. The body was first treated with natron and thus deprived of moisture. Then bitumen was poured over it to destroy the germs of decay. Wonderful as it is that corpses thus treated have resisted decay to have lasted centuries long, even to our own time, it must be noted that the mummy has only a distant resemblance to the body that the ancient Egyptian inhabited in his lifetime. It was impossible to preserve the soft internal parts from destruction. The process began with removing the lungs, heart, stomach, and intestines, followed by the brain, which was the first to decay. As a result of the mutilation of the body, the whole abdomen fell in. Moreover, the bone between the nose or mouth and the cavity of the brain was destroyed so that the brain might be extracted. The natron and bitumen consumed the fleshy tissues, leaving the bones and the black or dark brown skin. It is only in the case of the very carefully treated mummies of distinguished persons, especially of kings and queens, that the features remained recognizable. The corpses of the common people present, for the most part, a repulsive appearance. The corpse was laid carefully in the coffin, the mouth closed, the arms crossed on the breast, or it was laid straight alongside the body, which was usually stretched horizontally on the back.
Need a laptop that's built to perform and designed to last all day? Select Windows 11 PCs starting at $499.99 are now at Best Buy. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
In earlier periods, there are some exceptions to this rule. In the Jatagata period, before that of the pyramids, when embalming was far less common, the bodies were usually placed in a crooked position, and so they have been found as skeletons, the knees drawn up to the breast, the arms resting partly upon them, and the hands placed over the face. The dead must rest in the grave in the position in which the child awaits its entrance into the world, which by further analogy was also ascribed to the soul awaiting the resurrection. Somewhat later, and down to about 2000 BC, the corpse was often placed upon the left side, or if on the back, the head was turned to the left. That was the direction, looking towards the west and the realm of the dead, in which it was believed that the dead man could see out of his coffin and step forth from it. To express this possibility more vividly, two enormous eyes were painted or carved in relief on a corresponding spot outside the coffin, out of which the dead man's eyes might look. The coffin and the tomb wall often depict a door pointing in the same direction, but so that the false doors might serve only for the dead man's exit and not be used by enemies to break into the grave, and the coffin, prudent people supplied them with pictured bolts, carefully shot at. The remarkable thing is that in the innumerable texts about the fate of the dead in the underworld, the grave rites and Osiris' fate, the corpse's historical significance is never mentioned. The belief that the soul could occasionally return to the body to go about on earth is not sufficient to explain the adoption of so costly and tedious a process as embalming. That explanation seems even less satisfactory, considering that the soul wasn't limited to the body when it chose a physical form on earth. It could take on many other forms without requiring anything from the living. This absence of references suggests that the corpse was originally more important, and that preservation measures were continued until the need for them no longer seemed so essential. This is one more example of what must often be noted in the Valley of the Nile, namely, that primitive customs were kept up strictly orthodoxly even after their original significance had been forgotten for centuries, or at least greatly weakened. Further indications unite with those just mentioned to show that in ancient Egypt there was a time when the belief reigned that the immortal in man would always be connected with his body, even after the visible life was extinct to earthly eyes. The preservation of the body correlated with the duration of the immortal part. Therefore, the sarcophagus became the departed's home, where he could occasionally look and rise to go about the tomb. Consequently, the Egyptians strove to make the grave, the everlasting house, as large and habitable as possible, and to give the deceased everything necessary in his lifetime. Thus, there were placed the tomb furniture and utensils of all sorts for daily and occasional use, weapons for defense, writings with magic spells against demons or with entertaining contents to pass the time, male and female companions to enliven the loneliness of the grave, food and drink. The last were always indispensable, for the dead man felt hunger and thirst, like a god or a man living on earth. If offerings did not satisfy his cravings, he must slip out of his grave and try to steal food. He fell into despair at the most repulsive expedients if he did not succeed, ate dung and drank urine to still his gnawing hunger. The great anxiety regarding a similar fate is shown in some formulas in the pyramid texts, according to which the king could only hope to protect himself from such necessities with his magic power. Egyptian worship of the dead centers on feeding the dead, and the gods' adoration is shown in their care to ensure that these higher beings in the heavenly fields never go hungry. First, the needed gifts were brought to the dwellers in the other world in their actual form. Real oxen and geese were sacrificed, and bread and fruit were presented. Sometimes also men were slain at the funeral with much elaborate ritual, so that the dead man might be followed quickly into the other world by the servants he needed. Only embalming could make the gifts as durable as the deceased body. Just as the mummy had not lost its earthly form despite its process, it was believed that the food suffered no diminution of its nutritious qualities through similar embalming. Real offerings were naturally very costly, hence the idea of replacing them with counterfeit presentments arose. The grave contained small oxen, geese, loaves, and libation vases made of stone or baked clay. Occasionally people set up tables in the grave for offerings adorned with various carved viands. Using spells, the dead man could change these simulacra into their originals and dispose of them at his convenience. This custom had the advantage of rendering the gifts imperishable. No decay could touch them. Above all, however, human sacrifice, which was becoming inconsistent with advancing civilization, could now be dispensed with, and indeed it has been practiced seldom in historic times. As a rule, there were laid with the dead in the grave statuettes, the so-called ushabtis, answerers, those small figures of wood, stone, or silicious earth that now abound in our museums. Originally, it was intended that the dead man should wake them with a spell to till the land for him, and for this purpose they were supplied with farming implements, hoes, and baskets. Besides these men-servants, with which one dead man was often supplied by thousands, he occasionally had, though not often, women servants to form his harem in the next world. In early times, a whole household establishment of figures carved in wood was placed in the grave: bakers, brewers, bearers of gifts, boatmen, etc. We must add to the representations of offerings, besides those in plastic form, the scenes carved or painted on the tomb's walls. In them, the whole life of the ancient Egyptians is displayed before our eyes: farming from seed time to harvest, baking, the slaughter and cutting up of oxen, dressing of geese, brewing, pressing grapes for wine, and manufacturing various utensils. Then follow pictures of the pleasant pursuits of life: hunting in the swamps of the Nile, especially of the Delta, for birds, fish, and hippopotami, games of ball, dancing, gymnastics, harvest homes, etc. These are not merely pictures from the former life of the dead man, who, in the wall scenes, is always represented as a spectator, intended to keep vivid for the survivors the memory of his earthly career. They were also to serve a more important purpose. The deceased could animate them using spells so that the pictures would become realities. Then the corn sprouted in the fields, the fire burned, and the dead man sat by and gazed at the activity going on before his eyes for his pleasure and profit. The food grown was intended for his table, the servant's work secured him from want, the pictured scenes enabled him to repeatedly enjoy the pleasures of the chase in reality, and to the full. While pictured or modeled offerings to the dead were more convenient than actual objects, they still incurred a certain expense. Once people believed that a spell could transform drawings into actual objects, it didn't take long to believe that a more potent spell could spontaneously manifest desired objects. The Egyptians soon took this step. The simple repetition of a certain consecration form sufficed to create the offering. Be a royal gift brought to the god Osiris that he may give 1,000 geese and 1,000 loaves to the departed NN, is the formula, varied in expression but in substance always the same, that covers countless stones in Egyptian graves. It stands alone or in company with a longer invocation addressed to passers-by, ordering them to repeat the spell as a favor to the dead. The dedication bears the royal name, as I, the Nile Valley Pharaoh, was the designated mediator between his people and the god. He was of divine origin and sprang from the union of a god, usually the sun god Ra, with a mortal woman, generally the wife of his predecessor on the throne. As such, he was certain to gain a ready hearing among the higher powers whose circle he had left only for a short time, and to which he hoped to return after death as a comrade and equal. In more primitive times, the ruler himself celebrated all acts of worship, among which making offerings for the dead was one of the most important. As the state grew, this multifaceted activity became impractical. However, he continued to honor this old duty and custom by making prayers and offerings in his name whenever he interacted with the gods. The gift was not supposed to go directly to the dead man, but to the god who transferred it to the proper recipient. This practice corresponded to the facts of earthly life. In the valley of the Nile, every man owed his position, property, and food to the king, who granted him either the things themselves or the opportunity to earn them. Even the noblest was counted in theory as a vassal of Pharaoh, though he would have resisted jealously any interference of the king in his private affairs or business. Theoretically, everything in this world should be the same in the next. The divine king was also the absolute lord of all his subjects, especially of the dead. He who wanted to benefit the dead proceeded most wisely when he applied to this king and begged him, out of his abundance, to allow what was offered to any particular dead man to reach the one for whom it was intended. The god could do this in two ways, either simply by a gift or more solemnly using a decree, which in his kingly capacity he issued to the deceased, carefully drawn up in prescribed legal form. Many tombs, particularly from later periods, preserve such decrees on papyrus or stelae. The survivors place them in the tomb, hoping the god would confirm their contents at the right moment and order them to be carried out by the subject gods and the spirits of lower rank. In these forms, the generosity of the survivors takes a peculiar development. As long as real offerings had to be brought and pictures or images seemed necessary, they had been satisfied to give little, perhaps one ox or a few loaves. But the moment it became a matter of words, they showered gifts on the dead in thousands. The trouble was no greater, and the dweller's satisfaction in eternity was so much surer. In repeating the spells, it was important to distinguish exactly the name of the person to whom the gifts were destined. For fear other less favored beings would seize the offerings and keep them back from the rightful owner. In such documents, therefore, besides a man's name, that of his mother is generally added as a distinction, for in theory, the Egyptians always held the descent from the mother to be the surer and more important. This was especially the case in all religious matters, even in secular life and, above all, in questions of inheritance. Increased importance was attached to the descent from the father. The gifts were brought to the grave and arranged there. The spell was spoken in the grave or at its entrance. People assumed that the deceased man was physically present and had established his permanent residence within his corpse. The custom survived long after the belief associated with it had faded, and people assigned to the deceased a far wider dwelling than that afforded by the narrow limits of the tomb. The Egyptians still strove perpetually to make the tomb dwelling as pleasant and comfortable as possible. They continued treating the mummy as an immortal personality. They adorned the mummy with amulets to ease its transition into the afterlife and equipped it with a collection of spells to utter there. In short, they equipped it in every possible way for the journey to the gods. And yet, it was not Mama who was to take this journey. Still, something else, outwardly exactly like it, but personally a wholly distinct being, distinguished by the Egyptians as the Osiris of the dead man. The Egyptians never tried to explain the contradiction in our described conception. The relation of the Osiris to the mummy is a fact that we can only assert and accept, however illogical the belief in two, like yet unlike forms of the same personality may appear. Originally, the mummy served as the permanent residence of the immortal personality, but later, Osiris came to represent it. But notwithstanding the changed conceptions of the immortal part of man, the nation did not venture to give up its ancient habits and customs, although these had been made void of meaning by the new doctrines. The Book of the Dead, the best known and most widely distributed religious writing of the Middle and New Kingdoms from about 2500 BC, is devoted to the journey of the Osiris of the dead from the tomb to the throne of Osiris, the king. It contains the spells by which the dead man may hope to surmount the hindrances he meets in the course of his journeyings. Above all, as we have already noted, it contains the names of the demons of the underworld as well as the names of objects there. This knowledge is most important to the dead man, since to the Egyptians the name was not a mere chance mark of the thing it belonged to, but an essential part of it. Gods and demons must forcefully favor the man who knows and can pronounce their names. According to an old legend, the goddess Isis succeeded by stratagem in compelling the sun god to whisper his name in her ear, thereby appropriating the power of the divine king and becoming the greatest goddess. If a man correctly called a demon by name in the underworld, the demon could no longer cause mischief. If the deceased named a gate, it would fly open before him. If he knew the correct word, the corresponding item would become his. Interestingly, the Egyptian never attempted to map the path from the grave to the eternal home, even though he attempted to plan out the underworld in the book of that which is in the Duat, or the book of the gates. The sequence in which the deceased individual must traverse the distinct areas remains unfixed. Hence, there is no fixed succession for the Book of the Dead sections. One thing only seems sure: the way traverses the earth. Sometimes the dead man walks. Sometimes he goes by boat. In fact, he travels just as he might have traveled in the Delta in his lifetime. Earthly predators like snakes and crocodiles pose a threat to him. He longs for food and even more for drink, and early in his journey a goddess hands him a drink from a tree. Just as in the desert, it is among trees that the earthly wanderer finds life-giving water. The direction of his journey is toward the west, where the sun sets and where, behind desolate wastes, the secret of the land of the blessed is hidden. Occasionally these representations depict the north, or the sky near the Great Bear, as the home of the dead, coexisting with the kingdom of Osiris in the west. We have inserted entirely different conceptions into the Osirian doctrine, situating the land of the dead in the dark north. The Osirians believed that the dead were buried on the west side of the Nile Valley, on the edge of the desert across which they had to travel. It is unnecessary to describe the journey's individual events, which have sparked differing opinions even within the same period. It ended in the Hall of the Double Truth, where Osiris, supported by 42 attendants, sat as judge of the dead. The jackal-headed Anubis led the dead man into the hall, where he uttered a long prayer in which he enumerated 42 sins of which he was not guilty. He had wronged no man, had not oppressed his fellows, had been guilty of no malice, had committed no deed abhorrent to the gods, had not led masters to do injury to their slaves, had caused no one to suffer hunger or to weep, had neither committed nor commanded a murder, had not destroyed nor taken from the sacrificial bread, had not stolen the clothes and swathings of the dead, and had been convicted of no immoral act, etc. At the end of this appeal, Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, and Horus, son of Osiris, tested the truth of the assertions. They weighed the heart of the dead man against the symbol of truth, and the sentence was pronounced according to the result. The Book of the Dead says little about the fate of him who failed to satisfy the test. The Book of the Dead mentions his punishment, destruction, and the mysterious devourer from the west, but it doesn't elaborate. The possessor of a copy of the Book of the Dead hoped with his knowledge of magic to escape this terrible fate, but he needed no description of it. Each man pictured the lot he desired for himself: the dwelling in the realm of the just, the justified, in the fields of Alful. This realm was named after the likeness of earth and closely resembled the delta, even in its name, Alful, meaning, in the first place, the plants that spring up in swampy ground. The Nile flowed through it, its wide-spreading branches forming islands where the dead and the gods dwelt. Here, the immortals consumed food and drink, engaged in combat with their enemies, hunted, entertained themselves by playing draughts with their companions or souls, offered sacrifices to the gods, and navigated the canals. Their primary occupation was agriculture, as depicted in various representations of the fields of Alto. First, the soil is turned up with the plow, then the seed is sown. Afterward, the corn, which has grown much above a man's height, is reaped with a sickle. Oxen tread out the grain from which the chaff is winnowed, and which at last is offered up to the god of the Nile, to whom is primarily due the blessing of the harvest. Reincarnation. This doctrine, a comparatively simple one, conceiving life after death as much as life on earth, is certainly one of the oldest theories of immortality held by the Egyptians. The most diverse nations share similar conceptions. According to the primitive form of this doctrine, each man kept the position he had held on earth. He who had ruled in Egypt remained forever a ruler. He who had served was ever a servant. Gradually, however, the wish crept in to prepare for the dead a happier lot than he had enjoyed on earth. This end was to be gained using spells enabling him to lead a free and joyous life in the fields of Alu, served by the Ushabti statuettes that his friends had placed in his tomb. Should this celestial life pall, he could return to wander about on earth, visiting the places that had been dear to him, or he could sojourn for a season in his grave and receive his friends' offerings, or he could change himself into a heron, a swallow, a snake, a crocodile, or a god, and he could take any form he pleased. This pleasure reincarnation was not the Indian doctrine of transmigration. It was a privilege for the just and well-versed dead who knew the magic spells. It was not meant to gradually purify the soul. It procured for such a one the greatest possible mobility, the greatest strength imaginable. It equipped him with all-penetrating power and allowed him from time to time to pervade everything and all things without, however, being merged in the all or losing any part of his individuality. Ancient beliefs about the dead traveling to the West were more complex and contradictory, making them incompatible. According to this, the immortal part, which, together with the body buried as a mummy, had formed the earthly man, was not homogeneous as most races have assumed, but was composed of various elements. These separate parts, the number of which varied greatly according to different dogmas, were united in the body, but at the moment of death they left it, and each alone sought its way into eternity. This idea was added to the more common one of the fields of ale by thinking that, after the judgment scene, the different parts of the dead person could come back together again. This way, the earthly being would live again in flesh, blood, and soul, and then in the land of the blessed. However, most texts refer to these soul parts as distinct entities. We should talk about at least the most important ones because they were crucial to Egyptian afterlife beliefs. The best-known part of the soul is the Ka, a form exactly resembling the man, born with him and remaining with him till he dies. But as regards the king, it was supposed to be somewhat otherwise. In sculptured scenes, the king's Ka appears behind the monarch in the form of a little man, and sometimes the king is seen approaching his own Ka with prayers and offerings, receiving from it in return promises of success, fortune, and power. A corresponding relationship between themselves and their Kas was doubtless attributed to the gods, each possessing his own Ka. For example, the massive temple of Memphis is recognized as the home of the god Ptah, and stands out as the fortress of the Ka of Ptah. In the moment of death, the Ka left the man, becoming itself henceforth his real personality. To the Ka are addressed both prayers and offerings, for it needed food and drink, and dwelt in eternity without losing the power to occasionally return to the grave, become the Ka living in the coffin, and remain united with the mummy. The belief in this dual personality of man may have originated in dreams. During a man's life, his bodily form might sometimes be seen by his sleeping friends, despite him being far from them, and the same thing might happen after his death. It is also clear that the Ka and the dead Osiris are similar. This leads one to surmise that two strains of belief have mingled in the conventional religion of Egypt. One group refers to the immortal double as Osiris, while another refers to it as Ka. A third figure, which closely resembled the other two, played some part in the beginning of the new kingdom, especially in Thebes. This is the Khu, or 11 Aku, the perfect shining one of the dead. It is occasionally worshipped as a god and prayed to for the dead, and as in the fusion of two originally separate ideas, the Egyptian could speak of the Ka of the immortalized dead's Osiris to invoke his Khu. A man's name calls up his mental image, and the occasional comparison between Ka and name suggests that this experience affected the belief in Ka and may have given rise to it. Attention has already been called to the importance of the name, sometimes regarded as an immortal part of the man possessing an independent personality. Another part of the soul, the Ba, or human-headed bird, could, as we have seen, be considered the soul of the man, It often represents visiting the mummy, caressing it with its human hands, or going down into the grave to refresh it with food and drink. The texts mention 3 other independent souls. The Sahu has the form of a man swathed in mummy clothes. The Kaibit, usually represented as a huge fan, is intended as the shadow cast by the man in his lifetime, which, like Peter Schlemil's shadow in Chamiso's tale, had a real existence. Finally, there is the Sekhem, the reverend form, an incarnation of the man's outward appearance, transfigured but retaining its likeness to him. These 3 soul elements resemble the Osiris, or the Ka, so closely that it seems probable that they were adopted into the Osirian cult from other parallel creeds. Despite their frequent naming, their exact nature and significance remain unknown. The Ab, the man's heart, is much more important in the religious texts. The Egyptians considered the heart to be, in general, the seat of life. If the dead man wished to rise and live again, he must obtain possession of this absolutely indispensable organ. This idea led to the development of an indispensable organ. It was believed that the doctrine of the journeying of the heart would allow the man, upon his death, to journey into a different realm. Here the dead man found it, and finally succeeded in uniting himself with it anew. This temporary separation of the organ of life from the body presented a significant difficulty to the thoughtful Egyptians. The body could not survive without the heart, and they envisioned Osiris as the body's exact match. It was decided to give the mummy an artificial heart to replace the real one, which was replaced by round reddish-brown flints, or later by small models of the vessel where the heart was placed when embalmed. Sometimes it is represented by large images of the scarab beetle, flattened on the underside, the creature that, in the Nile Valley, always symbolizes life and development. Having previously been animated by spells, the artificial heart was inserted in the place formerly occupied by the real organ, and it was hoped that its presence would restore the body's warmth and vitality. The correct magic formula was written sometimes on the heart scar Bruce itself, sometimes in the collection of spells given for the use of the Osiris. We need not pay attention to other, less significant components of the immortal being here. It is sufficiently clear from what has already been passed in review that many independent beliefs combine to produce the doctrine of immortality outlined in the Book of the Dead and similar texts. Holding fast to all that he had inherited from his fathers, the ancient Egyptians certainly possessed a multitude of religious conceptions. A homogeneous religion he never developed. We may wonder how he could simultaneously believe in all these contradictory doctrines. He believed that after death he would dwell in the gloomy regions of the underworld, travel the heavens with the sun till the ground in the fields of the blessed, fly to heaven in the form of a bird, wander towards the west as a complete entity in human form, and be dissolved into the many parts of its immortal personality. We cannot answer the question. Modern research can only establish that all these conceptions were coexistent and regarded as equally authoritative. This is constrained even at the risk of placing it in a less favorable light, at any rate regarding the realm of speculative religious thought, that wisdom of the Egyptians so highly extolled by classical authors. As exhibited in their own records, the creed of the Egyptians as to life beyond death presents an extraordinary medley of philosophic notions and the crudest ways of thinking belonging to. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, circa 2613 to 2181 BC, is otherwise called the Age of the Pyramids, or Age of the Pyramid Builders, as it incorporated the powerful Fourth Dynasty, when King Sneferu idealized the craft of pyramid building, and the pyramids of Giza were developed under the rulers Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. One can check a few records dating back to Egypt's Fourth and Sixth Dynasties. Antiquarians see the historical background of the time as written in stone, and generally compositional, since researchers have been able to piece together a set of experiences through landmarks and their engravings. The actual pyramids transfer sparse data to their developers. However, the morgue sanctuaries were fabricated close by, and the stelae that went with them gave the rulers' names and other significant data. Further, engravings in stone made somewhere else at the time record different occasions and the dates on which they happened. At last, the burial place of the last lord of the 5th dynasty, Unas, gives the main pyramid texts, expanded artworks and engravings inside the burial chamber, which shed light on the strict convictions of the time. The pyramids, however, are fundamentally what the Old Kingdom is generally renowned for. The Old Kingdom is conceivably unrivaled in world history for the measure of development they embraced. The pyramids at Giza and elsewhere required exceptional administrative productivity to coordinate the assembled workforce, and this organization could have worked under a stable focal government. A pyramid is a design or landmark with a quadrilateral base ascending to a three-sided point. In the popular imagination, pyramids are often associated with the three desolate constructions on the Giza Plateau at the edge of the Sahara Desert. However, over 70 pyramids in ancient Egypt stretch down the Nile River Valley, serving as the focal point of remarkable sanctuary buildings. To a great extent, related solely to Egypt, the pyramid shape was first utilized in old Mesopotamia in the mud-block structures known as ziggurats, and kept on being utilized by the Greeks and Romans. Pyramids are additionally discovered south of Egypt in the Nubian realm of Meroe, in the urban areas of the Maya all through Central and South America, and, in a minor departure from the structure, in China. Egyptian pyramids. Known as Mir by the Egyptians, the pyramid was an illustrious burial chamber and was thought about as the spot of clime for the dead pharaoh's soul. From the beginning, it was thought that the main purpose of the pyramid would be to let the spirit spend eternity in the field of reeds, and, if it chose to, the high point of the pyramid, or living a daily life like a statue of the ruler, acting as a signal for the spirit to pick up. The straightforward mastaba was filled in as a burial place for the commoners, and sovereignty was the same. Yet in the early dynastic period, 3150 to 2613 BC, the pyramid configuration was created under the rule of Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, 2670 to 2613 BC. The early dynastic period in Egypt, circa 3150 to 2613 BC, is the start of the exact time of the country during which the areas of Upper Egypt, South, and Lower Egypt, North, were joined as one country under a unified government. During this period, the rulers established their heavenly guidelines, creating a conspicuous Egyptian culture that included composition, expression, and scientific advancements. During this period, people avoided using the title pharaoh, instead referring to rulers as rulers and addressing them as Your Highness. In ancient Egypt, the Old Kingdom's time frame, 2613 to 2181 BC, trailed behind the pre-dynastic period, 6000 to 3150 BC. These dates are objective, but they should not be used to start a new project. They help explain Egypt's long history by isolating its story into events' tight turn. The line between certain periods in old Egyptian history is clear, while others, for example between the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, are obscured. Dates are approximations the further back in time one goes in Egyptian history. Egypt's unification and first king. As indicated by Manetho's 3rd century BC order, the main lord of Egypt was Menes, a ruler of Upper Egypt, conceivably from Tunis or Hyrcanopolis, who defeated the other city-states around him and afterward proceeded to vanquish Lower Egypt. This present ruler's name is referred to through established accounts, for example Manetho's order and the Turin king list. Nonetheless, It is not substantiated by any broad archaeological proof, and researchers currently accept the principal lord may have been a man named Narmer who calmly joined Upper and Lower Egypt sooner or later, circa 3150 BC. This case is challenged, attributable to the Narmer palette, an old engraved piece, which portrays a ruler, emphatically recognized as Narmer, as a military figure vanquishing an area that is Lower Egypt. That Egypt was made through military methods is a fundamental idea communicated in the time frame's craft. A sizable arrangement of stone items, including ceremonial mace heads and ranges, contains war and battling scenes between men, among creatures, and among men and creatures. Though in the past, Egyptologists read the locations of war in a real sense as records of genuine occasions, today they like to consider them cliché proclamations of authority and the ruler's authenticity. This new technique for deciphering old engravings, however important some may think, does not mean such translations are precise. People who are against these translations ask why, if these engravings are meant to be symbolic. Others from later times, like the ones of Ramesses the Great at the Battle of Kadesh, are still read as if they were real records. According to this new method, it is difficult to say when Egypt became one country or who was responsible for it based on these descriptions. However, it does say that the craft of the time frame shows that the Egyptians connected unification with strife, no matter who the main ruler was. The name Menes signifies he who suffers, and might be a title, not an individual name. In this case, there is no trouble in recognizing the main lord as Narmer, who persevered. The title Menes has also been found on an ivory engraving from Nakada related to Hor-Aha, which could mean the title was passed down or that Hor-Aha was the principal lord. These old engravings, like the Narmer palette, show a situation that everyone agrees on. They could be seen as a landmark honoring a successful state of unity rather than showing the interaction of unification itself. For example, to researchers, the methods by which unification came about are not as significant as the reality of unification itself. Later, scholars may have generally embellished the subtleties of the occasion, just as they would with any country's roots. Menes most likely never existed, at any rate, as the individual responsible for all the credited accomplishments. Alternatively, he is a gathering of genuine people whose deeds were recorded through oral convention and distinguished as crafted by a solitary individual, accordingly making a focal legend figure for Egypt's unification. Like the Bible characters, Menes was part fiction, part truth, and the years have concealed the fringe, making a unification legend. Unification, brewers and others guarantee, was in all probability a lethargic interaction invigorated by monetary development. Upper Egypt appears to have been more prosperous, and their abundance empowered them to deliberately ingest the terrains of Lower Egypt over the long haul, as they discovered they required more assets for their populace and exchange. Regardless of whether the lord who joined the nation was Narmer or somebody of another name, this ruler established the framework for the ascent of perhaps the best civilization of the Old World, Egypt's first dynasty. Menes Narmer established Egypt's first dynasty, 3150 to 2890 BC, after its unification. The incomparable Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, 1853 to 1942, acknowledged Narmer as the primary tradition's principal lord, asserting that the two names were assigned to one man. Flinders Petrie and others following him guarantee that whether Narmer joined Egypt forcibly is viewed as superfluous, in that it is practically sure he needed to keep up the realm through military methods, which would represent his portrayal in engravings, for example, the Narmer palette. Narmer, likely from Thinis, wedded Princess Nithotep of Nakada in a partnership to reinforce ties between the two urban communities. He drove military campaigns by letting Egypt put down uprisings and extending his region into Canaan and Nubia. He initiated extensive infrastructure projects, and under his guidance, urbanization grew significantly. Egypt's urban areas never arrived at the greatness of those in Mesopotamia due to the Egyptians' acknowledgement of the dangers such advancement presented. Mesopotamian urban communities were generally deserted because of land abuse and water supply contamination, while Egyptian urban communities, such as Zeus, to pick an irregular model, existed for millennia. Although later advancements in metropolitan improvement guaranteed the continuation of these urban communities, it is the Lord's early endeavors, such as Narmer, that provided the model. It is conceivable that Nithotep controlled on her own after Narmer's passing, yet this case is a long way from being all around acknowledged. Her burial place, found in the 19th century, was comparable to a ruler's, and proposed a status more noteworthy than basically a ruler's significant other. Additional proof of her standard is her name engraved in serifs from a training held distinctly for a ruler, not a mate. Her rule is a long way from plainly verified. Narmer is thought to have prevailed by his child Horaha, 3100 BC, however, the two are similar, who proceeded with his dad's military extension and expanded exchange. He was particularly intrigued by religion and the idea of eternity, and the mastaba burial chamber, a house for the perished, was created under his rule. His child Jer, who adopted similar approaches to his archetypes, ruled Hor-Aha in 3050 BC. Jet, his child from 3000 BC, married Princess Mernith, and after his death it is believed she assumed control of the country. It is muddled whether she ruled as an official for her young child Den or administered as sovereign simultaneously. In any case, her rule denotes the first time a lady is authenticated as administering in ancient Egypt. Den, 2990 BC, her child, ruled for a long time and was considered the best lord of the first dynasty. His standing as a viable lord comes from his enhancements to the nation's economy, military triumphs, and his rule's solidness, as proven by rich structure projects and many-sided showstoppers. Sanctum is the main ruler who portrays Upper and Lower Egypt's crowns, plainly demonstrating an assembled country under his standard. Anegib and Semerkhet, two rulers who experienced troublesome rules set apart by revolt, trailed behind Nuk. Hotep Sekhmenwi, who established the Second Dynasty, curbed the rule of Kwa, whose replacements battled for the seat and ended the administration. The interior clash and the absence or disarray of records severely damaged the Second Dynasty, circa 2890, circa 2670 BC. None of the Second Dynasty leaders have irrefutable dates, and a large number of the names of rulers appear to be reiterations of prior rulers. Hotep Sekhmenwi, whose name signifies two groundbreaking ones find a sense of contentment, is an ideal illustration of this issue. It would bode well, as a result of his name, that he came to control after quelling the rulers who battled for the seat after Kwa. However, his name is recorded on the entranceway to Kwa's burial chamber, implying that 1, he was the ruler answerable for covering Kwa, and 2, he previously had that name before the battle over progression broke out. The claim that Hotep Sekhmenwi quickly put an end to the war after Kwa's death lacks evidence. Egyptian culture wouldn't have allowed the Lord's body to be covered in the hold for so long. It is conceivable that Hotep Sekhmenwi had just attempted to determine the contrasts between the sovereigns before Kwa's passing. However, this is simply a hypothesis. When Hotep Sekhmenwi ascended to the throne, Egypt achieved a brief period of harmony. Tumult and resistance characterized his rule. He was tumultuous. Resistance characterized his rule. He established the Lord heavenly connection by linking his name to the divine for the first time. His replacement, Ninetjer, and the accompanying Seneji managed the country's common issues. Little is known about them. Peribsen, also known as Seth Peribsen, overshadowed Sanji and sparked some controversy among researchers. Peribsen is the primary lord who separates himself from the Horus group and adopts the Set faction. This is critical because in Egyptian religion, Horus the Younger was the child of the extraordinary god Osiris, who vanquished Set to carry amicability to the world. As agreeable equilibrium was a significant incentive to the old Egyptians, it appears weird that a ruler would choose to adjust himself to the powers related to Bedlam. There is no satisfactory explanation for Peribsen's decision. Early researchers accepted that he was the primary monotheist who proclaimed Set the lone god, yet this has been disproven by proof of numerous divine beings' love during his rule. As his name is just recorded in Upper Egypt, there is a hypothesis that he decided to line up with Set for political reasons to remove himself from the Horus faction of Lower Egypt. In that exchange, people regard him as a decent ruler, regardless of the explanation. The economy, strict practice, and expressions of the human experience all prospered under his rule. The first full sentence written in ancient Egypt was found in his tomb. It read, "The brilliant one, he of Ombos, hath brought together and given over the two domains to his child, the lord of Lower and Upper Egypt, Peribsen." This suggests that Set, he of Ombos, had favored Peribsen's cause. The sentence likewise demonstrates that Egypt was bound together under Peribsen's rule, and his adjustment to Set to separate himself from the Horus faction of Lower Egypt is unsound. Khasekhemwy, possibly his child, defeated Peribsen. Khasekhemwy continued the building work of his ancestors and is thought to have brought Egypt's two regions back together under a central principle, or at least strengthened their unity. He is most popular for his landmarks at Hyrcanopolis and Abydos, and as the pharaoh Djoser's dad. Unification, Brewer and others guarantee, was no doubt a lethargic cycle animated by monetary development. Upper Egypt appears to have been more prosperous, and their abundance empowered them to efficiently retain the terrains of Lower Egypt after some time, as they discovered they required more assets for their populace and exchange. Regardless of whether the lord who joined the nation was Narmer or somebody of another name, this ruler established the framework for the ascent of probably the Old World's best development, Egypt's third dynasty. Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara is the initially realized pyramid implicit in Egypt. The third dynasty has been customarily connected to the fourth, and the time frame is known as the Old Kingdom because of its relationship with the primary pyramids. Notwithstanding, a late grant has set it toward the finish of the early dynastic period in light of the unique closeness in culture and innovation with the previous period compared to the last mentioned. The mastaba burial chamber was created during the first dynasty, and the step pyramid at Saqqara is a detailed, stacked mastaba, not a genuine pyramid like those found at Giza. In terms of innovation, Djoser's pyramid stands out. The vizier Imhotep planned the pyramid to serve as the ruler's permanent home, and subsequent pyramids would follow its basic design. Djoser, 2670 BC, fabricated countless landmarks that researchers have since long held his rule to have endured at any rate 30 years. Probably he managed more like 20. He started military missions to Sinai and kept up Egypt's attachment, bringing about the fundamental solidity of his structure projects and improving expressions of the human experience. Sekhmet, who Kaaba followed, ruled over him, and together they constructed the buried pyramid and the layer pyramid, among other notable structures. The third dynasty closes with the rule of Huni, 2630 to 2613 BC, about whom little is known. Upon his demise, he was succeeded by Snefru, who established the fourth dynasty, which started the time frame known as the Old Kingdom. The first dynastic period in Egypt was a period of progressive headways in culture. The schedule was composed. Information on technical studies, expressions, and agribusiness was all at a high level, as was the innovation needed to construct landmarks, such as the step pyramid. Significantly, they established strict reasonableness deeply, shedding light on the rest of Egypt's historical background. The idea of Ma'at, concordance, turned out to be generally esteemed during this time, and the agreement started to develop that life on Earth was just a single piece of an endless excursion. This arrangement was exclusively for people living under a steady government who did not need to stress over their well-being or occupation, driven to an arising feeling of the other on the planet, to the idea of time lasting and otherworldly qualities. They imparted to the Egyptians the belief that they were inseparable from the heavens and the universe. Their unwavering faith in the infinite and the unending daily routine of each experience would become the hallmark of their way of life, guiding each landmark, sanctuary, and building they constructed. In particular, the magnificent pyramids have become inseparable from Egypt. Imhotep, 2667 to 2600 BC, Djoser's modeler, decided to attempt an unprecedented endeavor, building a Goliath landmark entirely from stone. Then, in the basic mastaba burial chamber, he planned and designed an interaction whereby the prior mud block mastabas would be worked off a limestone block and put on top of each other, each level somewhat more modest than the one underneath, to make a pyramid. This arrangement of huge stone, stacked mastabas, painstakingly implementing a graduated plan, turned into the main pyramid in Egypt, the renowned Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Imhotep, 2667 to 2600 BC, was an Egyptian polymath, an individual master in numerous learning zones, most popular as King Djoser's Step Pyramid designer at Saqqara. His name signifies "he who comes in peace." His name signifies "he who comes in peace." He is the only Egyptian other than Amenhotep to be completely idolized, turning into the divine force of shrewdness and medication, or as indicated by certain sources, the Lord of Science, Medication, and Engineering. He served as an artist, doctor, mathematician, stargazer, and planner, making him the only Egyptian other than Amenhotep to be completely idolized. While his Step Pyramid is considered his most important work, he was also known for his clinical writings, which saw illness and injury as normal occurrences rather than punishment sent by gods, spirits, or enemies. In 525 BC, the Egyptians worshipped him, comparing him to the Greeks' demilord of recuperation, Asclepius. His works were still amazingly mainstream and persuasive during the Roman Empire, and the heads, Tiberius and Claudius, both had their sanctuaries engraved with recognition of the kind god Imhotep, Djoser's Step Pyramid. Under King Djoser's rule, 2670 BC, Imhotep was a vizier and boss planner. He held numerous titles, including first after the king of Upper Egypt, administrator of the Great Palace, chancellor of the king of Lower Egypt, hereditary nobleman, high priest of Heliopolis, and sculptor and maker of vases chief. By birth, Imhotep was an ordinary individual, yet his common gifts elevated him to the status of one of Egypt's most influential and persuasive figures. He may have started as a sanctuary minister and was a strict man. He turned out to be an esteemed minister of Ptah and was referred to respectfully as Child of Ptah. Under Djoser, and with his comprehension of the divine being's desires, he was in the best position to direct the development of the ruler's interminable home. Egypt's rulers' early burial chambers were mastabas, rectangular designs of dried mud blocks built over underground lodes where the dead were set. When Imhotep started assembling the Step Pyramid, he changed the Lord's mastaba's normal state from a rectangular base to a starting point. Why Imhotep chose to change the conventional shape is obscure, yet he likely had a square-based pyramid at the top of the priority list from the beginning. The early mastaba was underlined by two phases, and a basic, however powerful, development technique was utilized. The artistry was laid not vertically, but rather in courses slanted toward the pyramid's center, essentially expanding its primary steadiness. The essential material utilized was limestone hindrances whose structure took after that of huge blocks of dirt. Engravings and inscriptions of reeds had improved the early mastabas, and Imhotep needed to continue this tradition. His incredible, transcending mastaba pyramid would have similar fragile contacts and rich imagery as the more humble burial chambers that had gone before it, and, even better, these would all be worked in stone rather than dried mud. We recreated Imhotep in stone, which had recently undergone various material treatments. The outside of the fenced-in area divider looked like the mud-block graves. The sections looked like groups of reeds and papyrus, and stone chambers at the thresholds of doors faced up reed screens. The development of the pyramid at the complex's focal point demonstrates a significant amount of experimentation. It had a few plans with mastaba structures before it turned into the initial step pyramid, heaping 6 mastaba-like levels on top of one another. The manufacturers tested the giant mass's weight by setting the stones at an internal grade to prevent the landmark from separating. When completed, the step pyramid reached a height of 204 feet, 62 meters, making it the tallest design of its time. The encompassing complex incorporated a sanctuary, patios, hallowed places, and living quarters for the clerics, covering 40 sections of land, 16 hectares, and encompassed by a divider 30 feet, 10.5 meters, high. The divider had 13 bogus entryways cut into it, with just one genuine passage cut in the southeast corner. The divider was then ringed by a channel 2,460 feet in length and 131 feet wide. Imhotep constructed the intricate as a morgue sanctum for Djoser, yet it became a phase and a compositional model for the Egyptian public's profound standards. The step pyramid was a solitary pyramidal burial place, with various sanctuaries, churches, pavilions, hallways, storerooms, and lobbies. Fluted segments arose out of stone as per his arrangement. However, he arranged the complex's dividers to match those of the ruler's royal residence, as indicated by old design styles, thereby maintaining a connection with the past. Djoser was so intrigued by Imhotep's creation that he dismissed the antiquated point of reference that only the ruler's name appeared on his landmarks, and Imhotep's name was engraved. At the point when Djoser passed away, he was set in the internment chamber underneath the step pyramid, and Imhotep is thought to have proceeded to serve his replacements, Sekhmet, 2650 BC, Kaaba, 2640 BC, and Huni, 2630 to 2613 BC. Researchers differ on whether Imhotep served every one of the 4 lords of the Third Dynasty, yet proof recommends he carried on with a long life and was tremendously pursued for his gifts. Third Dynasty Pyramids. Imhotep may have been associated with the plan and development of Sekhmet's pyramid and complex, which archaeologists accept was initially planned to be more prominent than Djoser's. The pyramid was never finished because Sekhmet passed away in the 6th year of his rule. However, the base and first level show similarities in the plan to Imhotep's work on Djoser's pyramid. Kaaba, who ruled Sekhmet, left his pyramid, now known as the Layer Pyramid, incomplete after his death. The Layer Pyramid is likewise comparable in the plan to Djoser's landmark, particularly in the square base for the establishment and building inward toward the center of the construction rather than upwards. We don't know if Imhotep planned the Layer Pyramid and Buried Pyramid, or if they were based on his designs. Some researchers contend for Imhotep's hand in the later pyramids. Others challenge that guarantee. As the two sides of the discussion highlight, a similar proof and the same old thing have arisen to steer the results. The matter remains uncertain. Imhotep is believed to have also served the last ruler, Huni, but due to the lack of knowledge about Huni's rule, This case remains theoretical. People once believed that Huni built his pyramids, but now they attribute those to other rulers. Clinical contributions. 2,200 years before Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, existed, Imhotep practiced and wrote about medicine. He is mostly thought to be the creator of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, an Egyptian clinical book that contains just about 100 anatomical terms and depicts 48 wounds and their treatment. The content may have been a military field manual and dates to 1600 BC, long after Imhotep's time, which is believed to duplicate his previous work. The explorer who purchased the Edwin Smith Papyrus from a relics collector in 1862 gave it this name. The writing is in hieratic content, the cursive shorthand of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The most mysterious part of the work is the advanced methodology it needs to treat wounds. In contrast to the Old World's numerous clinical writings, there is little response to mysterious medicines in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. The Edwin Smith Papyrus objectively portrays and determines each injury, including its after-treatment, anticipated outcome, and explanatory notes. This means there is no implication to clinical practices usually utilized at that point. The opposite side of the papyrus highlights 8 wizardry spells and serenades for recuperating. Assessments resemble advanced visits to a specialist. Patients are asked where they are harmed, feel torment. The doctor tends to the injury by contacting, pushing, and scrutinizing the patient. The visualization given after each passage starts with the expressions, "A sickness I will deal with," "An infirmity I will battle with," or "An affliction for which there is no hope," which, as per the U.S. Public Library of Medicine's article regarding the matter, could be viewed as the soonest type of clinical morals, as an old doctor would, by and large, not treat a condition he knew was lethal. The National Library article proceeds to see that these forecasts could likewise have filled in as a sort of protection when a helpless result is normal, and would have helped save a doctor's standing if treatment neglected to fix the patient. Imhotep is also thought to have written several detailed works about religion and morality, such as verses, logical perceptions, and building compositions, but these have not survived. They are mentioned in the writings of later journalists. Few landmarks hold a special place in humanity's experiences. Critical said without misrepresentation that his pyramid complex is comprised of achievements in developing amazing stone designs in Egypt and on the planet. Here, limestone was first utilized for a huge scope as a development material, and here, the possibility of a highly illustrious burial place as a pyramid was first figured out. In a 19th dynasty engraving in South Saqqara, the old Egyptians portrayed Djoser as the opener of stone, which we can decipher as the importance of stone design innovator. Imhotep started the advancements credited to Djoser, following his vision to fabricate an enormous landmark entirely out of stone. He had the option to envision an accomplishment endeavored, maybe never at any point considered, and make it a reality. In doing so, he changed the world. The incredible sanctuaries and authoritative structures, royal residences and burial chambers, the magnificent landmarks of the pyramids, and the transcending sculpture that characterized the Egyptian scene all started with Imhotep's vision of the step pyramid at Saqqara. When a landmark work of stone has been cultivated, it may be endeavored repeatedly to make the genuine pyramids of Giza more prominently scrupulous and improve innovation. Further, guests to Egypt who saw these colossal manifestations brought back reports of them to their nations, such as Greece, based upon what Imhotep had first envisioned and afterward made genuine. As we would perceive the construction today, the main pyramid showed up in the 4th dynasty under the rule of Snofru, who finished 2 pyramids at Dashur, just as the work started on his dad's pyramid at Meidum. These pyramids likewise utilized the degree of stone squares of limestone. However, the squares were cut more modestly as the design rose, giving a smooth external surface, rather than the means shrouded in limestone. The most extraordinary example of a pyramid working in Egypt was the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, the final of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, with a base covering 13 sections of land and comprised of 2,300,000 stone squares. Known as the Horizon of Khufu in ancient times, the pyramid positioned itself according to a precise visionary plan. A large portion of the 20 or so rulers constrained many workers to quarry, transport, set up, and enrich huge amounts of stone to develop imperial funeral home monuments. For this reason, they redirected tremendous assets from the whole country, filling a 70-kilometer extended length of the desert edge along the west bank of the Nile, close to present-day Cairo, with colossal landmarks remarkable today, notwithstanding the attacks of time. The Old Kingdom 4th dynasty was a period of progress and a solid, united government that could deserve the sort of admiration vital for such structural projects. However, during the 5th and 6th dynasties, the ministry consolidated its power primarily through its control over funeral home practices. This led to the construction of the Great Pyramids, which enabled the local authorities to maintain their majesty. The Old Kingdom started to implode as an ever-increasing number of neighborhood lead representatives expected more control over their areas, and the focal government at Memphis was progressively seen as unessential. Toward the end of the 6th dynasty, there could have been no focal administration of note, and Egypt entered a time of social distress and renewal known as the First Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2040 BC. During which Egypt was controlled territorially by nearby officers who made and upheld their laws. The ascent of these neighborhood authorities and the Brotherhood's force were not the only purposes of the Old Kingdom's breakdown. Nonetheless, a serious dry spell at the end of the 6th dynasty brought starvation, which the public authority could never really mitigate. Researchers have additionally highlighted the astoundingly long rule of Pepi II of the 6th dynasty as a contributing element, since he outlasted his replacements and left no beneficiary to the seat. Many researchers today don't see the end of the Old Kingdom as a breakdown, but rather as a shift to the new way of thinking that came with the First Intermediate Period, when local rulers honestly represented their areas, and the kind of wealth that was once only available to the wealthy became more widespread. People still believe there was a political and social breakdown near the end of the 6th dynasty. This is because the central government didn't have enough power and money, directly affecting the local standard of the area nomarchs. The 3rd dynasty and the Old Kingdom. Archaeologists authored the name Old Kingdom in the 19th century to delineate Egypt's long history. The actual Egyptians did not allude to this period by that name and would have seen no contrast between the time frame that went before or succeeded. Researchers usually put Egypt's 3rd dynasty, 2670 to 2613 BC, in the Old Kingdom because of the pyramid of King Djoser at Saqqara. It was the biggest pyramid that ever stood in Egypt, and it seemed to connect that tradition with the building efforts of the 4th dynasty because the last lord of the 3rd dynasty was the same person as the first ruler of the 4th, and Djoser and his successors ran the country from Memphis, the White Dividers, which was the capital during the Old Kingdom. Notwithstanding late Grant rejects see the development of Djoser's pyramid as more about the early dynastic period in Egypt, 3150 to 2613 BC, than the Old Kingdom social practices and observances. Djoser's engineer Imhotep, 2667 to 2600 BC, altered development in Egypt by building the Lord's burial place at Saqqara out of stone. Prior to Imhotep's progress, mud blocks constituted burial places in various designs. Egypt's early burial chambers were mud block mastabas, yet Imhotep needed an enduring commemoration of his lord. So it built a complex with a stone pyramid in the middle and sanctuaries all around it. Every tradition that followed, to varying degrees, adopted this worldview. Furthermore, During the Third Dynasty, the nation's autonomous conditions became known as nomes, areas, directly under the control of a concentrated government in Memphis. Egyptologists knew that the Third Dynasty began a new era in Egypt's history. They observed that the Old Kingdom, rather than the early dynastic period, warranted commemoration. This was because of the changes in government, technology, and strict rules. Researchers today view the Tob dynasty as a transitory stage with a stronger connection to the preceding period than the previously mentioned one. Even though Djoser's pyramid of stone was a completely new creation, it used early dynastic period strategies. The pyramid at Saqqara is a pile of mastabas instead of a genuine pyramid, and concerning the political changes and making of nomes, the focal legislature of the Third Dynasty did not have the scope or order of the assets of the Fourth Dynasty. Thus, and others, the Old Kingdom is presently thought of regardless of the Fourth Dynasty of Egypt, even though it ought to be noticed. This case is not generally acknowledged among researchers. The first true pyramid. The last lord of the Third Dynasty, Huni, 2630 to 2613 BC, was for some time thought to have started the gigantic structure undertakings of the Old Kingdom in developing the pyramid at Meidum. Yet credit for the Meidum pyramid goes to the primary ruler of the Fourth Dynasty, Sneferu, 2613 to 2589 BC, who may have been Huni's child by one of his minor sovereigns. Egyptologist Barbara Watterson states that Sneferu started the brilliant age of the Old Kingdom. His most striking accomplishments were the two pyramids that worked for him at Dashur. Sneferu started his work with the pyramid at Meidum, currently alluded to as the imploded pyramid, or locally as the bogus pyramid due to its shape. It takes after a pinnacle above a pyramid, and its external packaging rests around it in a massive pile of rock. The Pyramid of Meidum is the genuine principal pyramid built in Egypt. However, it did not last. This is because adjustments were made to Imhotep's unique pyramid plan, which brought about the external packaging lying on a sand establishment instead of rock, making it break down. Scholars disagree on whether the breakdown occurred during the pyramid's development or over a longer period. In his work, prehistorian Borchardt made sure that the pyramid was built in stages, with the outside base gradually sinking into the sand and the inside base solidly resting on stone. Egyptologist Miroslav Werner talks about this. When the workers got to the third stage of the structure interaction, the outside packaging and design needed to be attached because they weren't balanced properly. As a result, there was a huge slippage during the last stage of development that buried the specialists. Nevertheless, different researchers differ and guarantee that the external packaging kept going into Egypt's New Kingdom, 1570 to 1069 BC. It has been suggested that the pyramid complex was rarely finished, since different designs and incomplete sanctuaries have been found at Meidum. This lends credence to the theory that the pyramid collapsed at an early stage, likely during its construction. Sneferu gained from his slip-up, be that as it may, and proceeded to his next two pyramids at Dashur. Ruler Sneferu and his pyramids. Sneferu's pyramids at Dashur are known as the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, or North Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid is purported because it ascends at a 55-degree point and then moves to 43 levels of more modest stones, giving it the appearance of bowing toward the top. The specialists had completed the establishment and the sides of the pyramid before realizing that a 55-degree point was too steep. They then adjusted their arrangement to complete the project overall successfully. Sneferu has perceived the issue and assembled his third pyramid. As indicated by engravings on the Palermo stone, Sneferu was a much appreciated lord who deserved incredible admiration from his kin. Barbara Watterson, remarking on the Palermo stone engravings, composes, "He led military operations in Sinai to safeguard Egypt's interests in the turquoise mines, northern Nubia and Libya. He returned from Nubia with 7,000 detainees and 200,000 prisoners, and from Libya with 11,000 detainees and 13,100 head of cows. Presumably, he used the detainees to increase the labor force in quarries. In succeeding ages, Sneferu obtained the standing of being helpful and liberal, and as indicated by a story described in the Westcar Papyrus, fit for the basic touch, intending to refer to one of his subjects as my sibling. The Westcar Papyrus. The antiquated Egyptians delighted in narrating as one of their #1 side interests. Stories have a long history of popularity in Egypt, as shown by the engravings, pictures, and stories. Stories could be about anything from seeing gods or having strange experiences to thinking about the meaning of life and supernatural events. The fascinating assortment of stories regularly distributed under the title Tales of Wonder or King Cheops and the Magicians comes from the Westcar Papyrus. These accounts, set in the hour of Lord Khufu of the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, 2613 to 2181 BC, concern mystical and wondrous occasions that occurred previously and presently, and indicate what is to come. In the original copy, every one of Khufu's children talks, thus telling their own story for their dad's diversion, until his child Hardadef claims it would be more intriguing to encounter a miracle in the present, and creates an entertainer for this reason. At that point, the 5th story picks up where the 4th story ends, recounting the mystical birth of the initial 3 lords of the 5th dynasty. These are the most captivating stories from ancient Egypt, so unpredictable in their subject and setting that some researchers consider the parchment more of a novel than a collection of short stories. History of the Scroll. The Westcar Papyrus is a parchment dated to the 2nd Intermediate Period, 1782 to 1570 BC. As most Egyptian papyri do, it takes its name from the name of the one who originally obtained it, Henry Westcar. Under obscure conditions, Westcar bought the piece in 1824 while going to Egypt. Since he never revealed how or where he came into ownership of the lookover, its provenance is lost. Nobody knows where or what setting it was initially found. It was either bought or obtained unlawfully by the renowned Egyptologist Carl Lepsius in 1839, who had the option to peruse it to a limited extent. However, no genuine advancement was made in arranging what the papyrus contained until it was converted into German by Adolf Ehrmann in 1890. Ehrmann's interpretation, which calls the accounts fantasies, set the pace for later interpretations that decently notice the performer or marvel in their titles. The parchment has disappeared except for the final lines and the original 5 stories. The writing followed the hieratic content of traditional Middle Egyptian and the Hyksos time frame. Evidence exists of eradicating a previous book. The parchment bears the label of a palimpsest, a composition based on original copy pages that previously housed another work. Given the high cost of papyrus scrolls as composition material, the expectation was to remove an old archive and reuse the papyrus for a new work. For this situation, in either the late Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1782 BC, or the 2nd Intermediate Period, a copyist eliminated a previous work from the look to record a story set in the Old Kingdom. The work setting makes dating the piece dangerous because, although the papyrus dates to the 2nd Intermediate Period, the narratives would be well written in the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom emerged following the 1st Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2040 BC, during which the Old Kingdom's collapse left the central government weak. Center Kingdom writing, which is among Egypt's best, reliably dates back to bygone times of the Old Kingdom and frequently utilizes gadgets, as in the prophecies of Nefertiti, to set a story in the time of the Old Kingdom where somebody makes a prediction concerning future occasions. The acclaimed admonitions of Aipur is another Middle Kingdom scholarly work along these equivalent lines. It is about the awful reality in Egypt, where the strength of the Old Kingdom has been lost, and disarray reigns in the land. In the Second Intermediate Period, the Egyptian government was unique to Thebes city, administering over a piece of the country. Nubia controlled some portion of Lower Egypt and the southern level of Upper Egypt, while the unfamiliar Hyksos held the Delta district. Like the Westcar papyrus, a papyrus fits more flawlessly with Middle Kingdom writing than Second Intermediate or New Kingdom, 1570 to 1069 BC, works. Egyptologist William Kelly Simpson asserts that the work seems to have a place with Dynasty 12. This would put it in the best line of the Middle Kingdom. Egyptologist Verena Lepper likewise puts the piece in the Middle Kingdom but dates it to the 13th dynasty. We reliably date the papyrus to the Hyksos time frame, placing it in the Second Intermediate Period, but overall, it remains obscure. From the Second Intermediate Period to the New Kingdom, the work became plausible during Ahmose the Phry's 1570 to 1544 BC expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt. This would bode well in that a progression of stories encompassing the amazing Khufu and his children of the Old Kingdom and finishing with a prescience of extraordinary lords to come would fit with the nationalistic bent of New Kingdom writing. The main story is absent, except for the set piece toward the end, which likewise shows up in the following two, where Khufu commends the story by directing that penances be done to the lords included in it and the individuals who played out the marvels. The end specifies the ruler Djoser, 2670 BC, and doubtlessly concerns his splendid modeler and polymath vizier Imhotep, 2667 to 2600 BC. The next story concerns Nebka, a strange ruler supposedly from the Third Dynasty, and his visit to a minister's home. The cleric's better half engages in extramarital relations with a young man from Nebka's escort, which the minister finds. At that point, he makes a wax crocodile that he provides for the overseer to drop into the lake where the adolescent washes. When this occurs, the crocodile springs up and hauls the young fellow to the base. The cleric carries Nebka to the lake to see the marvel, hits the crocodile, and transforms it into a wax figure. He mentions to Nebka what has occurred, and the ruler denounces the adolescent and the spouse. The wax crocodile is turned into a genuine one, taking the young fellow while the double-crossing spouse is scorched to death. In the third story, Lord Sneferu feels exhausted and discouraged, and his main minister recommends he take a boat ride with the most lovely ladies in his group of concubines. They all set out on the lake, and Sneferu is delighted when one of the ladies loses a green fish-shaped gem from her hair and stops paddling. She denies Sneferu's proposal to supplant it. Thus, he calls to the main minister, who is additionally on the boat, to accomplish something. The minister parts the lake's waters, recovers the gem, and shuts them once more. Sneferu is satisfied. The ladies line up, and the cleric is compensated for a marvel that the author of Exodus would later acquire for his work. In the fourth story, Khufu's son Hardadef complains that all the stories have been about the past, even though miracles can happen now. He informs the Lord about a man who can do amazing sorcery. For example, reattaching a head whenever it has been cut off, and knows numerous mysteries, and Khufu sends him to carry the man to court. Hardadef recovers the sage, Jedi, and when they enter the royal residence, Khufu orders a detainee to be brought and beheaded. However, Jedi stops him, saying how he cannot play out this enchantment on a person since it is against the divine being's will. He effectively shows his forces on a goose, a waterfowl, and a bull. Jedi then asks about Thoth's altars and says he can't convey the insider facts because they should come from Redadet's oldest child, who will procreate the next rulers. The fifth story begins with Jedi's final lines, where Redidet faces a challenging task. The god Ra sends Isis, Nephthys, Meskenet, Heket, and Khnum to help her. They show up at the house camouflaged as performers and artists, and discover Redidet's significant other, Rewosra, upset about the work. He accepts their assistance, and Isis, Nephthys, and Heket transport the three children. These will be the initial three lords of the fifth dynasty, Userkaf, Sahur, and Kakai. Rewosre is thankful and gives the hidden divinities a sack of grain to blend, brew, and leave. Isis recalls that they have given nothing phenomenal to the kids or their folks. Thus the divine beings make 3 imperial crowns, put them in the sack, and return to the house. They create a tempest as a pardon, and ask whether they can leave the grain sack so it will not get wet. The sack has then secured a room, and the divine beings go. After 14 days, when Redidet recuperated, they set up a gathering, and her maidservant disclosed that they had no grain to blend lager with, aside from the sack Rewosre provided for the artists. Redidet says to utilize it, and Rewosre will supplant it before they return. When the housemaid enters the room, she hears music and festivity. Frightened, she runs to inform Redidet. Redidet goes to the room, understands the sounds from the sack, and sees the 3 imperial crowns. She is excited that her children will be rulers. However, they fear Khufu's discovery, so she has the sack in a chest. A few days later, she conflicts with the maidservant, who is attempting to reveal the mystery to Khufu while she is on her way. During this conflict, she pauses to inform her sibling of the events. Her sibling becomes irritated that she would undermine the house's woman in such a manner and beats her with a whip. A crocodile devours the maidservant as she rushes to the stream for water. The story and the original copy end with the sibling going to the house to tell Redidet what has occurred. He finds her upset and inquires about the situation. Redidet informs him about the maidservant fleeing to tell Khufu and how she is concerned about what will occur. The sibling reassures her that her mystery remains protected, as a crocodile has eaten his sister. The original copy appears to serve now, yet it guarantees that the location of the sibling consoling Redidet is the piece's finish. The papyrus provides ample space for a planned, more extended end. The Westcar papyrus is likely the main bit of Egyptian writing since it exemplifies mainstream stories. Numerous instructive stories show a thing or two that are still engaging, yet the Westcar papyrus narratives fundamentally target engagement first. Dissimilar to different stories expected to teach and educate the upper and working classes, this content style and language demonstrate that it would have been associated with Egypt's well-known custom, passed on orally by open narrators heading from town to town. In any case, as David further notes, the narratives had political and strict disseminator points in that they featured divine assistance in the births of the initial 3 rulers of the 5th dynasty. They also depicted Khufu and his children as standard individuals occupied with a night of storytelling. A modern reader might find it strange that the recorder places the story so far into the inaccessible past. How could it aid in reminding people of the divine right of long-dead rulers? Jedi's prescience about the rulers and the story of their introduction to the world with the 3 goddesses would have shown people the heavenly interest in natural issues and the importance of divinely affirmed rulers. The 5th dynasty had its issues, all things considered, with the expenses brought about by the rulers of the 4th dynasty in building their huge landmarks at Giza, excluding the ministers from tax collection, and paying the ministry for consistent upkeep and the ceremonies needed to respect the spirits of the dead. A later period, grappling with its issues, might have found solace in the knowledge that earlier individuals had fought and triumphed. So would they? The Westcar papyrus's composition at a high or low point in the Middle Kingdom, or later in the uncertain intermediate period, would have been significant and comforting to the first crowd. Sneferu appears to have been an entirely open ruler, undaunted by disappointment or disillusionment. When the bent pyramid did not meet his desires, he began the third endeavor. The Red Pyramid, allegedly due to the use of rosy limestone during its construction, ascended at a 43-degree angle from a strong base. 344 feet, 105 meters high, the Red Pyramid was the most effective genuine pyramid that worked in Egypt. Initially, it was encased in white limestone. As the other later pyramids were likewise, they fell away throughout the long term and were gathered by locals for other structure projects. Ruler Sneferu, through his military campaigns and reasonable utilization of assets, set up an incredible focal government at Memphis, which delivered the sort of dependability fundamental for his huge structure projects. Following the case of Djoser's unpredictability at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary sanctuaries and different structures built around his pyramids, with ministers dealing with the everyday activities once the Red Pyramid was finally finished. The entirety of this contends for a steady society under his rule, which he left to his child Khufu when he passed on. Khufu and the Great Pyramid. Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BC, was known as Cheops by the old Greek scholars and is most popular for his Great Pyramid at Giza. The Greeks portrayed him as a dictator in their compositions who mistreated individuals and constrained them to work for him without wanting to. This impression may have been made by the tales that make up the archive known as the Westcar Papyrus, an assortment of 4 stories expounded on the rulers of the 4th dynasty and found or acquired from a relic seller in 1824 by Henry Westcar. The papyrus includes 4 stories told by Khufu's children. One of them is about how King Khufu calls an entertainer to court who says he can reattach a severed head to a body. Some researchers have figured out that King Khufu was being cruel or neglectful when he asked for an exhibit. The Westcar Papyrus portrays him as careless with life, while various engravings portray him as severe and despotic. In the performer's narrative and the cut-off head, be that as it may, Khufu appears to be generally suspicious of the soothsayer's capacities. And different stories, however, related by Khufu's children or replacements, have to do with different lords. The Westcar Papyrus gives no sign that Khufu was a dictator or abusive in any capacity. Herodotus, who wrote that Khufu brought to Egypt each sort of malevolence for his magnificence, driving 100,000 men all at once for a quarter of a year persistently to chip away at his pyramid, undoubtedly served as a model for the ancient Greeks who penned Cheops. Further, Herodotus claims Khufu so needed cash that he sent his little girl to work in the whorehouses of Memphis and requested an exorbitant cost for her administration. Egyptian writings praising Khufu's rule and real evidence that the workers on the Great Pyramid were often focused on doing their jobs as part of a local government, as paid workers, or during times when the Nile flood made farming impossible, slandered his reputation. Were it not for the 2 months when the Nile's water covered Egypt's farmland and sat the whole labor force, none of this development would have been conceivable. During such occasions, a pharaoh offered nourishment for work and the guarantee of supported treatment in the afterworld, where he would manage similarly as in this world. For a very long time every year, workers assembled by the several thousand from everywhere in the nation to move the squares a perpetual group had quarried during the remainder of the year. Supervisors organized the men into groups to transport the stones using sleds, which were more efficient than wheeled vehicles for moving heavy objects over shifting sand. A highway, greased up by water, smoothed the tough draw. No mortar was utilized to hold the squares set up. It was just a definite fit that these transcending structures have made do for a very long time. The lone wonders of the ancient world standing today, the pyramids, Giza, Egypt. The Great Pyramid is ideally one of Giza's constructions. It was viewed as one of the antiquated 7 wonders of the world, and in light of current circumstances, until the Eiffel Tower was finished in 1889, the Great Pyramid was the tallest design on Earth worked by human hands. The size boggles the brain. It was 146 meters high, 479 feet, by 230 meters at the base, 754 feet. We gauge that it contained 2,300,000 squares of stone with a normal load of 2 3/4 tons, weighing as much as 16 tons. Khufu administered for 23 years as indicated by the Turin royal canon, which would imply that all through his rule yearly 100,000 squares, day by day around 285 squares, or one at regular intervals of light, must be quarried, moved, dressed, and put in place. The development was practically perfect in the plan. The sides aligned precisely with the cardinal focuses and at exact 90-degree angles. Herodotus and the later Greeks saw Khufu. His kin appreciated him. During his rule, Egypt developed much more affluently through his military missions against Nubia and Libya and his extremely prosperous economic accords with urban communities such as Byblos. He additionally gave assets to improving the existence of his subjects through agrarian advancements. Miroslav Werner expresses, "During his reign, the most punctual known dam on the planet was underlying Wadi Garawi in the mountains west of present-day Helwan. This dam helped the ranchers and others locally by improving the water supply. Although Memphis remained the capital of Egypt during Khufu's rule, he undoubtedly lived in Giza's castle to manage the Great Pyramid work. To maintain the most extreme effectiveness in government and last as brief a period as possible, he gave his confided-in relatives the best measure of capacity, who were probably satisfied with the course of action, as there was no interior record difficulty during his standard. Khafra, the Sphinx, and Menkaure. After Khufu's demise, he prevailed over a relative outside the genuine line named Jedefre, 2566 to 2558 BC. Werner noticed that early Egyptologists considered the obliteration of this current ruler's pyramid complex in Abu Rawash to prove an inner family struggle. However, the escalating decimation began during the Roman era, when the landmark deteriorated into a stone quarry, and the Romans utilized the stone for other structural projects. Jedefre was Khufu's child. However, it appears he was not his chosen replacement. Speculations concerning family intrigue against him in any case seem unwarranted. In any case, the primary aspect of Jedefre's rule was not his pyramid or his fabrication of the Sphinx, but rather his relationship with the sun god Ra's Clique. He was the first lord of Egypt to claim the title Child of Ra, signifying his authority as a subordinate of the sun god. In the second dynasty, ruler Raneb had connected his name to the divine beings, thus settling the Lord as the divine beings' delegate on earth, the living exemplification of the divine beings. After Jedefre's change, the Lord would, in any case, be viewed as a heavenly delegate. However, he is now in a more subordinate situation as an offspring of God. Certain researchers consider Jedefre, for example Dobrev in 2004, the great Sphinx maker of Giza, while others attribute this landmark to his sibling and replacement Khafre, 2558 to 2532 BC. The Sphinx is the biggest solid sculpture on the planet, portraying a leaning back lion's body with its head and face. Most people recognize this current ruler's face as Khafra's, but Dobrev and others assert that it could actually be Khufu's. It is puzzling that Khafre made it since it follows his pyramid entirely, and the Sphinx's face looks more like Khafre's than Khufu's. Khafre's pyramid ascends much higher than its celebrated neighbor, even though it stood 10 feet more limited when it was new. The sparkling packaging of white limestone, moved by boats from quarries across the Nile, covers the top and is laid inside limestone blocks cut from the encompassing Giza site. Most likely, throughout liberating these inside squares, quarrymen struck a crease of harder stone they dodged, leaving a little slope. Khafra had this outcrop cut, looking like a supine lion bearing his face, the celebrated Sphinx. The Pyramid of Khafra is the second biggest in Giza, and his complex is nearly as stupendous as his father's. Little is known about his rule, yet the Greeks, who called him Chephren, saw him similarly as they had his dad, as a dictator who persecuted his kin in light of a legitimate concern for building his great mortuary landmark. Egyptian writings demonstrate he followed his dad's approaches and government model to put power in possession of his nearest relatives and keep a tight command over strategies and laws. Khafra related himself to the god Horus, as prior rulers had done, and the Sphinx was viewed as a picture of the Lord as the god Harmaket, Horus in the horizon. Unlike the rulers of the early dynastic period, Khafra and his successors referred to themselves as a child of Horus, implying a connection to God, not just the living God. Figuring out what the divine beings wanted while still within the ruler's reach helped the ministers who served those divine beings become better at what they did. After Khafra's death, Baka, the son of Jedefre, briefly interrupted the progression. He did not rule for a year. Notwithstanding, before Menkaure, 2532 to 2503 BC, Khafra's child became a lord. Both Greek and Egyptian writings hold a favorable view of Menkaure. Menkaure started constructing his pyramid and sanctuary complex at Giza like his dad and granddad. Although today, the Giza level is an antiquated sand-cleared site on Cairo's edges, in the era of Menkaure, it was a city of the dead occupied by the living who focused on it. Ministers' homes, sanctuaries, laborers' lodging, shops, processing plants, breweries, and all the parts of a little city were available at Giza. As opposed to the prevalent view that the pyramids of Giza were worked on by slave work, explicitly Hebrew slave work, they were built by Egyptians, a significant number of exceptionally gifted laborers who were paid for their time. People believe the pyramids represent the early stage hill, the Ben, which emerged from the chaotic waters at the beginning of creation. Even though slave workers from Nubia, Libya, Canaan, and Syria were probably utilized in the quarries cutting stone or in the gold mines, they would not have been depended on to make the ruler's permanent home in the picture of the principal earth to ascend from the waters. We have not found any slave quarters at Giza, nor any Egyptian records relating to any event, such as those recorded in Exodus's scriptural book. Laborers' quarters, chiefs' homes, and administrators' homes have all been found, and they clarify that the work done at the Giza level in the Old Kingdom was performed by Egyptians working for remuneration. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are more modest than the other two, which means a significant advancement throughout the Old Kingdom's existence, and one reason it would fall. The assets essential for the Great Pyramid structure were not, at this point, accessible in Menkaure's time, yet he drew on what he could to make an unceasing home comparable to his dad's and stupendous father's. Menkaure's child, who chose Kuenre as his replacement, died during the construction of the pyramid, disrupting the dynastic succession. Menkaure himself passed on before the pyramid complex was finished. Even though he ruled for exactly 30 years, he was unable to complete the work his archetypes had started, which many researchers believe meant the critical assets at his order were lost. His replacement, Shepseskaf, 2503 to 2498 BC, completed Menkaure's mind-boggling work at Giza while wearing a genuinely unobtrusive Masaba Saqqara. As recently noted, the rulers redirect tremendous assets to their morgue landmarks and buildings. However, these sanctuaries and altars were increasingly under the minister's control. After Shepseskaf's concise rule, the Fourth Dynasty concluded, and the Fifth started with significantly less guarantee than when Sneferu succeeded Huni. The Fifth and Sixth Dynasties in collapse. Sneferu had first connected his administration with the sun-powered clique of the god Ra, yet Jedefre diminished the lord's status from a living god to the child of that god. The seat suffered from the cleric's force, but the Lord was the divine being's agent on earth and deserved respect and force. Precisely how much regard and force were winding down, notwithstanding. The fifth dynasty is known as the Sun King's tradition because many have the god Ra's name, typically given as Re. The initial three rulers, Usakaf, Sahure, and Kakai, would later be regarded as supernaturally named in the story The Birth of the Kings from the Westcar Papyrus. The line starts with the Lord Userkaf, 2498 to 2491 BC. However, a lady named Kenkauers, presumably a girl of Menkaur, is generally included in the engravings of the time as mother of two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt. However, it is obscure who those rulers were. Her burial chamber is the fourth pyramid at Giza, and she was a vital figure, yet little is known about her. Usakaf is most popular for developing the Temple of the Sun at Abusir. This structure denotes a significant takeoff from the ruler's part toward the start of the Fourth Dynasty and the start of Giza's finish as the necropolis of the lords. The sun god Ra was presently venerated straightforwardly by individuals through the organization's workplaces, and the ruler's role as an immediate delegate to God was reduced. In the Fourth Dynasty, one of the regal titulary parts, the Ns-Dawui bit, king of Upper and Lower Egypt name, was incidentally composed inside a cartouche, meaning the Lord decided over all that the sun's circle, or Ra, was enclosed. The Fifth Dynasty popularized the cartouche, referring to rulers as the child of Ra. In past administrations, rulers were considered the natural sign of the god Horus. Simultaneously, adding the new title to the illustrious titulary decreased their status from god to a child of God. The Lord's divine authority was additionally dissolved in the Fifth Dynasty when sanctuaries were raised at pyramid destinations, not, as in the past, for the love of the ruler, but for the festival of the clique of Ra. Sahura, 2490 to 2477 BC, the child of Userkaf, built his funeral home complex in Abusir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahur was a productive ruler who coordinated the main Egyptian endeavor for the land of Punt and arranged important economic deals with different countries. In any case, Punt was among his most prominent accomplishments, as it would become a significant wellspring of many of Egypt's most valued assets and, as expected, be viewed as a legendary place where divine beings exist. Sahur assembled his own temple to the sun at Abusir and was the first to utilize the pilliform segments in engineering, which would become standard for sections throughout Egypt from that point on. The notable segments whose tops are molded like palm fronds. The detailed work done on Sahur's tomb complex and the engravings that were found show that he did good things for the country and the military and with his money. Neferkare Kakai, his child, ruled over him from 2477 to 2467 BC. Engravings demonstrate he was a decent ruler and very much regarded, yet little is known about his rule. Apart from that, his reign marked a significant improvement in the ministry. His child, Neferefre, 2460 to 2458 BC, succeeded him, but passed away briefly during his rule, likely around 20. The ruler, Shepsekare, succeeded him. However, nothing is known about his rule. Nusere Ini, 2445 to 2422 BC, reigned over him, during which the clerics of Ra gained significant power. The administration of the sanctuaries and morgue buildings expanded, which put strains on the imperial depository, which paid for the sanctuary's upkeep and support. The Lord Menkauhor Kayu, 2422 to 2414 BC, succeeded him. However, almost nothing is known about his rule. He was the last ruler to fabricate a temple to the sun. Jedkare Isesi ruled over him from 2414 to 2375 BC. Djedkare Isesi's starting points are obscure. Although he is not considered the child of Menkaure, there may have been some connection. The broad renewal of the administration and the brotherhood to maintain a steady economy distinguishes his rule. Djedkare Isesi dismissed the customary act of building a sanctuary for the sun god and diminished the number of ministers who were important for Morgue edifice's support. He likewise coordinated the subsequent endeavor to Punt, which advanced Egypt and further fortified bonds with Punt. Djedkare Isesi's departure from the religion of the sun god may have been influenced by the growth of the Osiris group and their emphasis on eternal life through a connection to the god who had passed away and returned to life. Albeit the Osiris faction would not get well known until the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, 2040 to 1782 BC, proof emphatically proposes that this previous rural divinity was related to death and restoration during the Old Kingdom. The fact that his clique continued to revere Djedkare Isesi long after his death supports this claim. Likwe ultimately turned out to be more far-reaching and considerably more famous than the faction of Ra, and Djedkare Isesi, as an early imperial follower of the religion, would have deserved incredible admiration from later individuals. The main part of Djedkare Isesi's rule, notwithstanding, was the decentralization of the public authority at Memphis, which put a more influential force in the possession of neighborhood authorities. This decreased the monstrous administration expenses that had grown during the 4th and prior 5th dynasties. Although the idea may have appeared beneficial, it provided additional capacity to districts where local clerics were sufficiently influential to nominate legislative chairpersons. This rendered the Lord's previous attempts to reduce the minister's force practically insignificant. Djedkare Isesi was prevailing by his child Unas, 2375 to 2345 BC, about whose rule little is known. Unas was the primary ruler of Egypt to have the inside of his burial chamber painted and set apart with engravings, which have come to be known as the Pyramid Texts. The engravings depict the Lord alongside Ra and Osiris, bolstering the theory that Osiris's religion shaped Djedkare Isesi and transformed Ra's brotherhood. Unas, the ruler who succeeded him, demonstrates this by placing both gods on equal footing in his tomb. The 6th dynasty, decline, and collapse. The Lord's role significantly decreased when the 6th dynasty began. During the rule of the principal lord, Teti, 2345 to 2333 BC, nearby authorities and overseers constructed more intricate burial chambers than honorability. According to Manetho, a 3rd century BC history student, his protectors killed Teti, a crime that would have been unfathomable even at the time. Userkare, 2333 to 2332 BC, who may have been behind the plot to kill the ruler, dominated Teti. His rule was short, and he was then dominated by Merayer Pepi IV, 2332 to 2283 BC, under whose rule the nomarchs, nearby overseers of the nomes, turned out to be all the more impressive. This pattern proceeded with the rule of Merenre Nemtiensef, 2283 to 2278 BC, and into that of Neferkare Pepi II, 2278 to 2184 BC, who went to the seat as a youngster and passed away as an older person, denoting an unbelievable rule of nearly 100 years. Under Pepi II's long rule, the Old Kingdom consistently fell. The developing force of commonplace nomarchs alongside the ministry disintegrated the focal governments and the Lord's authority. As the 6th dynasty ended, royal power declined quickly because it cost too much for the royal budget to maintain the tombs of past rulers and give gifts to aristocrats like morgue equipment and contributions. The investments of morgue clerics, who expanded the number of burial chambers, moved abundance away from the organization's ruler. Simultaneously, the force of commonplace lid representatives grew until they became nobles of their fiefdoms. Merenre Nem-Tiemsaf II, 2184 BC, trailed Pepi II with a swift rule. The last pharaoh was Netjerkare, Naitikirti Sipta, 2184 to 2181 BC. Some researchers and Egyptologists, like Percy E. Newberry and Toby Wilkinson, recognize her as the Queen Nitocris from Herodotus's story, Histories, Book 2.100, about an Egyptian queen who kills her killer brother by suffocating his killers at a meal. Nitocris, 2184 to 2181 BC, is the Greco-Roman name for Nitikret, the last ruler of the 6th dynasty of Egypt, which closed the Old Kingdom's time, circa 2613 to 2181 BC. Nitocris is most popular in the story recounted by Herodotus, 484 to 425/413 BC in his Histories, Book 2100, in which she kills the professional killers of her sibling at a dinner. For as long as a century, the trustworthiness of Nitocris has been addressed by researchers, even though her name shows up on the Turin King's list of Egyptian rulers. It is additionally referenced by Manetho, 3rd century BC, in his rundown of 6th century Egyptian rulers, and by Eratosthenes of Cyrene, 276 to 194 BC, in his Theban list of Egyptian monarchy. Flavius Josephus, 37 to 100 AD, references Herodotus's story in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 8.6.2, calling her Nikal and not scrutinizing the genuineness of the story. Eratosthenes' notice of Nitocris is known through Apollodorus of Athens, 180 BC, referred to by Syncellus, circa 810 AD, in his selection of chronography. This queen's name is considered a typo because no engravings, landmarks, or burial sites match it, and there are no later references to her. Some researchers are sure that her name is Naitikirti Sipta, the last lord of the 6th dynasty. As of late, an expanding number of Egyptologists and researchers have come to acknowledge that Herodotus's record may have some premise, and Nitocris is progressively being perceived as the primary queen regnant of Egypt and the last ruler of the Old Kingdom. The main idea behind this new evaluation of Nitocris is unclear, but it may have something to do with the type of evidence first put forward by Egyptologist Percy E. Newberry, 1869 to 1949. According to Newberry, we should recognize the credibility of Nitocris as a real Egyptian ruler, not just a character in Herodotus's story. Herodotus's record of Nitocris is regularly referred to as the lone proof of the sovereign ever. While it is the solitary hotspot for the account of her vengeance, there are, as noted, different sources. After he came 330 rulers, whose names the ministers discussed from a papyrus roll. Taking all things together these countless ages, there were 18 Ethiopian lords and 1 sovereign local to the country. The rest were all Egyptian men. The sovereign's name was equivalent to the Babylonian princess Nitocris. To vindicate her sibling, he was the ruler of Egypt and was killed by his subjects, who at that point gave Nitocris the power. She put a significant number of the Egyptians to death in bad form. Under the guise of initiating it, she set up an open underground chamber, but with a different expectation in mind. She made a grand entrance, welcoming those Egyptians she knew were most complicit in her sibling's murder. Keeping in mind that they ate, she let the waterway in upon them through a vast, mysterious channel. This was all that the clerics recounted to her. Then again, when she had done this, she cast herself into a chamber loaded with hot remains to escape retaliation. Chronicles 200. Researchers got suspicious of this record when no Egyptian sources were found to authenticate it, and considerably more so when it was viewed that Herodotus revealed a comparable occasion a couple of parts later. In part 107 of a similar book, he relates the Egyptian lord Sesostris, who gets back from a mission and stops close to Pelusium, where he meets his sibling, whom he had left accountable for the country, while away. An incredible feast is held out of appreciation for the ruler. However, while he and his family are inside, his sibling orders the structure ringed with wood and set ablaze. Sesostris escapes by using 2 of his children as human scaffolds, enabling the others to reach safety. The Lord later made arrangements with his double-crossing sibling, Histories 2.107. This story additionally has no known validation in Egyptian history, and further, various lords have been related to Sesostris, among them Senusret III, Amenhotep III, and Rameses II. Sesostris has also been referred to by various antiquated history specialists as having overcome the known world or having vanquished Egypt, as she is viewed as a legendary figure, a blend of various accounts of various Egyptian lords not verifiable. Manetho records Nitocris's name and acknowledges her as bolder than any man of her time and of unparalleled excellence. He likewise, notwithstanding, credits her with building the third pyramid, which has been totally dismissed by Egyptologists since it is ground that the third pyramid was worked by Menkaure, 2532 to 2503 BC. Eratosthenes records her as administering for a long time from Thebes and notes she was the 22nd ruler since Menes, a sovereign, not a lord. Her name signifies Athena the Victorious, but gives no further subtleties. Josephus refers to her as Nicole and refers to Herodotus. However, he does not expound on the vengeance story. Apollodorus of Athens protected Eratosthenes' table of Egyptian rulers, and Syncellus later referred to it likewise with no extra data. Herodotus's lack of verification led to the view of Nitocris as legendary. Still, Percy E. Newberry argued in 1943 that these other sources should be examined more closely to prove that Nitocris was true and that real proof could be found in Egypt if someone knew what they were looking for. Percy E. Newberry is not even close, also known as he ought to be. Newberry brought Howard Carter to Egypt in 1891 and put Carter on the search for the burial place of Tutankhamun in 1922. Indeed, Newberry collaborated with Carter during the materials exhumation and evaluation, and his plant science expertise enabled him to identify specific natural elements present in the burial site. In the article Queen Nitocris of the 6th Dynasty, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, Newberry explained his point of view. He said that it is momentous that his colleagues think of this woman as either a lord or a legendary figure when there is ample evidence to show that she was the first fully confirmed queen of Egypt. The Turin King's List and the Abydos King's List record Tokris, with Saqqara as her burial place. He deciphers Nitocris's name as Nith is excellent, and shows how the name Nith shows up on the burial chamber of one of Pepi II's sovereigns. At that point, he mentions a fascinating objective fact concerning Manetho's disavowed guarantee that Nitocris constructed the third pyramid. Newberry points out that a few years ago, the renowned Egyptologist Flinders Petrie noticed that Manetho essentially claimed to have assembled the third pyramid. Since then, researchers have assumed he was referring to the third pyramid at Giza. However, this may not be a significant finding for him. Since Manetho gives no area for this third pyramid, it is conceivable that he was alluding to the third at Saqqara, not at Giza. Regardless of whether Manetho implies the third pyramid at Giza, Newberry notices that this does not mean one should dismiss his record, since the praenomen, given name, of the lady in the burial place of Nith at Saqqara may have been Menkaure, which might have been effectively mistaken for Menkaure. Nitocris, Newberry claims, may have been Pepi II's spouse who lived so long that all his beneficiaries kicked the bucket well before he did. His significant other might have stepped in to run the show in such a circumstance. This translation concerns Eratosthenes' report that Nitocris was a sovereign, not a lord, a line that can likewise be deciphered as a spouse instead of her significant other. Herodotus wrote that a queen killed her lord's sibling to get revenge. But Newberry's evidence about the burial site and the translation of Eratosthenes' line doesn't support this story because Pepi II was not her sibling and lived and ruled for 60 years. It is also noteworthy that she was the spouse of Merenre the Pharnos, 2287 to 2278 BC, who was not killed and did not pass away in his youth. Further, Pepi II's better half, Ninth, does not fit the time frame for the rule of Nitocris, nor is her pyramid burial chamber at Saqqara III fabricated. Egyptologists have for quite a while held that Ninth's burial chamber was initially developed and the most detailed after the king's. Scholars have deemed it most probable that she was the sister of Merenre Nemtiemsaf II, 2184 BC, Pepi II's child and replacement. However, people dismissed these claims, believing Nitocris to be an anecdotal character. One could contend that her sibling was Nefertiti-Siptah, normally recorded as the last ruler of the 6th dynasty and having a swift rule. Notwithstanding, this present ruler's experience on the seat compares precisely to Nitocris's own, so Egyptologists came to trust that her name was a scribal botch for his. The most likely clarification is that Nitocris was Merenre Nemtiemsaf II's sister, who ruled for just a year after Pepi II and would have been the last ruler before Nitocris. Egyptologist Jaromir Malik, among others, argues that the turmoil that followed after Pepi II's passing brought about befuddled and missing records, and that the sovereign Nitocris, was the last ruler of the 6th dynasty. Pepi II was ruled by Merenra II Nemtiemsaf, Queen Nitocret, 2184 to 2181 BC, and approximately 17 fleeting lords who addressed Manetho's 7th and 8th dynasties. Most of these rulers are minimally more than names for us. However, a few are known from the defensive declarations given for the sanctuary of Min at Coptos. The 6th dynasty had been deteriorating for quite a while during Pepi II's rule, and his passing incited a dynastic emergency more genuine than anything Egypt had seen since the establishment of the state. The Egyptians kept exceptionally cautious records of all they did. However, those from the 6th dynasty's finish are befuddled or non-existent. Egyptologists regularly portray the Old Kingdom's breakdown as a massive social disturbance and political disarray. Wilkinson, composing on Nitocris in the breakdown, notes that Nefertiti-Siptah was of unsure parentage, and we cannot be sure about sex. The name proposes a man. However, later convention distinguished Nefertiti as a supreme sovereign, and after Nefertiti, who left no landmarks or even engravings, the seat was passed from one powerless ruler to the next. Amidst this emergency following Pepi II's passing, Merenre Sekhu appears to have come up short on keeping everything under control. It is conceivable that Nitocris was viewed as a more grounded ruler than her sibling, whoever he may have been, as she was raised to the seat after an upset. This is an unadulterated hypothesis. Be that as it may, since no proof, other than Herodotus's report, exists. In any case, more researchers presently acknowledge the record as substantial than it was likely at some other time. The principal queen regnant of Egypt was Nitocris, 2180 BC, of whom not a lot is known aside from that she went to the seat during a period of political shakiness on the passing of a mature ruler, Pepi II, who had ruled for more than 90 years. Manetho attested that she was the noblest and loveliest of the ladies of her time, of reasonable composition. and, as per Herodotus, she ended it all in the wake of getting revenge on the ones who had killed her sibling to put her on the seat. With the demise of Nitocris, the Old Kingdom concluded. There is no admission to the old understanding of Nitocris as a legendary figure or the after effect of an old spelling mistake. Even though Newberry's claims about the pyramid burial chamber at Saqqara aren't very strong, his argument that Nitocris should be recognized because she is remembered for two rulers' lists, just like Eratosthenes did, is more strongly supported. Malik notes that numerous rulers are minimal more than names, from around a similar period and whose trustworthiness goes unchallenged. The sovereign from Herodotus's record is perceived as a genuine chronicled figure, even though researchers are still working with similar data from 100 years prior.